Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Before Otto von Bismarck became the Iron Chancellor, Germany did not exist as one country. It was a broken map of kingdoms, duchies, free cities, old loyalties, jealous rulers, foreign pressure, and unfinished dreams. Then one Prussian aristocrat with a rough voice, a dangerous patience, and a talent for turning crisis into opportunity helped redraw the center of Europe. Bismarck did not begin as a modern nationalist hero. He was a monarchist, a landowner, a defender of old authority, and yet he became the man who used war, diplomacy, parliament, newspapers, kings, and public opinion to create something new. His story is not only the story of German unification, it is the story of how a conservative mind learned to command the forces of a modern age. If you enjoy these long historical journeys, a quiet like and subscription helps the channel keep growing, with new full-story episodes published every week. And while you listen, let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from and which person, topic, story, or era you would like Quiet Chronicles to cover next. For now, the story begins before Bismarck held power, before Germany had an emperor, and before anyone could know that a scattered kingdom called Prussia was waiting behind the map. Chapter 1: A Kingdom Waiting Behind the Map. Central Europe after Napoleon did not look like a country waiting to be born. It looked like a settlement, carefully arranged by men who had survived revolution, empire, occupation, and exhaustion, and who wanted the continent to become governable again. The map held kingdoms, grand duchies, duchies, principalities, free cities, church lands that had already been swallowed into secular rule, and borders that carried the memory of older bargains. German speech crossed many of these boundaries, but speech alone did not create a state. A merchant in Cologne, a courtier in Munich, a farmer in East Prussia, and a senator in Hamburg belonged to different political worlds, even when printed books and educated conversation called them German. Prussia stood inside this arrangement with a shape that made it powerful and awkward at the same time. Its eastern lands stretched across Brandenburg, Pomerania, Silesia, and East Prussia, where monarchy, army, and landed nobility had long formed a hard political habit. Far to the west, after the settlement of 1815, it also held the Rhineland and Westphalia, provinces with Catholic populations, commercial towns, mines, workshops, and a memory of French administration. Between these western and eastern possessions lay other German states. Prussia was not a compact kingdom pressing naturally outward from one center. It was a kingdom with separated limbs, joined by law and crown more than by geography. Napoleon's defeat had made this strange inheritance possible. Before 1806, the old Holy Roman Empire had still existed as a loose and ancient shell over German political life, though its practical force had long been weak. Napoleon ended it, rearranged much of German territory, reduced the number of states, and forced rulers to confront a modern style of administration and war. When the French emperor fell, Europe's diplomats did not restore the old empire. They created something more cautious, the German Confederation, a league of 39 states whose purpose was cooperation without unity. The Congress of Vienna gave that confederation its formal place. Metternich, the Austrian statesman whose mind moved naturally toward balance and restraint, wanted a Central Europe that would not again become the road of revolution or conquest. Prussia received compensation and territory, but Austria kept the presiding role within the German Confederation. The Federal Diet met at Frankfurt, where envoys represented governments rather than peoples. It was not a parliament in the later national sense. It was a diplomatic body, slow by design, where status, instruction, and procedure mattered as much as public argument. That arrangement suited the fears of 1815. A unified Germany would have been too large for the comfort of France, too unsettling for Austria, and too uncertain for the smaller German rulers who valued their thrones. The Confederation gave German states a common framework for defense and consultation, while preserving the sovereignty of princes and city governments. Its very weakness was part of its purpose. It prevented German fragmentation from becoming chaos, but it also prevented German feeling from becoming state power. Prussia's place within the Confederation was therefore uneasy from the beginning. It was one of the two great German powers, but not the senior one. Austria possessed imperial prestige, a larger dynastic world, and long experience in managing the politics of Central Europe. Prussia possessed an army tradition, a disciplined bureaucracy, and a monarchy that had learnt severe lessons during the Napoleonic period. No one looking at the Confederation in its early decades could say with certainty that Prussia would one day lead Germany. Yet the materials of that future were already present, stored inside institutions rather than displayed as destiny. The Prussian reform era had begun in humiliation. After the defeats at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, the kingdom had been forced to examine itself with an honesty that victory rarely permits. Reformers such as Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau did not make Prussia liberal in the full constitutional sense, but they changed parts of its administration, military organization and social order. Serfdom was weakened, municipal government gained new forms, the army was reorganized, and the state learned to draw more effectively on the energies of its subjects. The reforms were uneven, contested, and limited. Even so, they left behind a more capable state than the one Napoleon had broken. Frederick William III remained cautious, pious, and often reluctant to move faster than necessity required. His kingdom had been saved in alliance with Russia, Austria, Britain, the wider coalition against Napoleon, and that memory encouraged prudence. Prussia could not behave as though the German lands were merely waiting for its command. It had to live inside the Vienna Order, respect Austria's formal position, and manage its own internal differences. The western provinces alone required careful handling because their legal habits, religious life, and economic interests did not fit neatly into the older eastern pattern of crown and junker estate. In the Rhineland, Prussia inherited more than land. It inherited populations accustomed to the Napoleonic Code, to different administrative routines, and to a more urban and commercial public life than many Eastern nobles found familiar. Catholic communities did not always look toward Protestant Berlin with trust. Merchants and industrialists wanted roads, tariffs, predictable law, and access to markets. Their concerns were not identical to those of aristocratic landowners east of the Elbe, whose wealth and authority rested on estates, grain, tenants, and service to the crown. Prussia was learning to govern a society more varied than the old monarchy had been built to contain. The economic thread mattered because it offered a quieter road toward German connection. The Zollverein, the customs union that Prussia helped lead from the 1830s onward, reduced trade barriers among many German states and made economic cooperation easier before political unity became possible. Customs houses and tariff schedules lacked the glamour of battles and proclamations, but they changed habits. Goods crossed borders more smoothly. Merchants learned to think in larger markets. Prussia's administrative reach began to touch German life in ways that did not require flags or speeches. Austria's absence from the Zollverein was one of those facts whose importance grew with time. The Habsburg monarchy was vast, multilingual, and tied to territories far beyond the German Confederation. Its rulers had to think about Hungary, Bohemia, northern Italy, Galicia, Croatia, and the Balkans, not only about German affairs. Prussia's interests were narrower and more concentrated, even when its territories were scattered. This difference did not yet make Prussian leadership inevitable. It did mean that the two powers were not solving the same problem. German nationalism existed within this world, but it did not yet command it. Students, professors, poets, veterans of the anti-Napoleonic wars, and some members of the educated middle class spoke of a German fatherland with warmth and seriousness. Festivals, songs, pamphlets, and university circles kept the idea alive. Governments watched these currents with suspicion, especially when national language mixed with demands for constitutions and civil liberties. For Metternich and his allies, nationalism could not be separated safely from revolution. A united people might soon ask why princes and diplomats should decide everything for them. The Carlsbad decrees of 1819 showed how closely the old order watched these forces. After the murder of the conservative writer August von Kotzebue by a radical student, the German Confederation imposed measures against nationalist and liberal agitation. Universities were supervised more closely, student associations were restricted, and censorship tightened around the printed word. The decrees did not erase national feeling. They pushed it into monitored lecture halls, private circles, cautious publications, and the memories of young men who learned early that German unity could sound to governments like sedition. Prussia participated in this conservative order, but it was never only a police state or military camp. It contained reformers and reactionaries, bureaucrats and landowners, Protestants and Catholics, old provinces and new ones. Its monarchy promised a constitution during the wars against Napoleon and then delayed the fulfillment of that promise. Its officials could be efficient, its officers disciplined, and its nobles proud of service, but the kingdom was full of unresolved bargains. Authority held. Consent remained incomplete. This was the world into which Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815. His birth year mattered less as an omen than as a placement. He arrived with the Vienna settlement, with the Confederation, with Prussia's recovery from defeat, and with the unresolved question of whether German unity would remain a dream, a danger, or a tool. The Germany he would later help create was not waiting in the open. It lay hidden inside customs agreements, dynastic rivalries, army reforms, provincial differences, parliamentary frustrations, and the long patience of a kingdom still learning what its own shape might allow. Before Bismarck could become a statesman, he first belonged to this Prussian world in a more intimate way. He was not born in Berlin's ministries or in the western towns where industry was beginning to alter the rhythm of work. He came from the landed East, from a family whose assumptions were older than nationalism and whose loyalties ran first toward estate, crown, and rank. To understand the man who later used modern forces with such cold fluency, the story has to leave the map for a while and turn toward Schönhausen, toward family inheritance, youthful disorder, and the making of a restless junker. Chapter 2. The Young Junker from Schönhausen. Otto von Bismarck entered the world on the 1st of April 1815, while Europe was still settling the dust of Napoleon's return and defeat. His birthplace, Schönhausen, lay east of the Elbe, in a landscape where noble estates, royal service, Lutheran habit, and rural hierarchy formed the familiar grammar of Prussian life. The village did not contain the future German Empire in any obvious sense. It contained land, family memory, duty, and the old expectation that a man of Bismarck's birth would serve the crown without confusing himself with the people who made speeches about liberty. That inheritance mattered because Bismarck's later modernity did not begin in modern convictions. His father, Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, belonged to the landed nobility with the easy manners and limited urgency of a country gentleman. His mother, Wilhelmine Mencken, came from a more educated and bureaucratic family, connected to the service nobility and shaped by the habits of administration. Between them, Bismarck inherited two Prussian worlds that never fully merged inside him. One was the world of soil, hunting, estate accounts, and local standing. The other was the world of examinations, offices, written reports, and advancement through state service. A useful part of his later character grew from that division because he could speak the language of aristocratic loyalty while understanding the machinery of government better than a merely provincial nobleman. Schönhausen itself had history enough to give a child the sense of belonging to something older than personal ambition. The Bismarcks had served Brandenburg and Prussia for generations, though not always from the highest rank of nobility. Their position was respectable, rooted, and proud, but not grand in the way of the greatest court families. Estate life trained its own assumptions. Land did not merely provide income, it gave a family its place, its obligations, its neighbors, its tenants, and its right to be heard. In Eastern Prussia, political thought could begin with the fence line, the manor house, the church patronage, and the district official before it ever reached a constitution. Wilhelmine did not intend her son to remain only a country noble. She saw in him the possibility of a career in the higher service of the state, and she pushed his education with an ambition more urban than rural. Bismarck was sent away young, first into schools that placed him among boys being prepared for public life rather than estate management alone. The separation left marks. He later remembered his schooling without much tenderness, and it is not hard to see why a child from an estate world might feel the coldness of discipline when it came early and in institutional form. At Göttingen, where he studied law, Bismarck entered a university culture that mixed learning with status, rivalry, drinking, and ritualized masculine display. Student dueling belonged to that world, less as lawless violence than as a harsh code of honor among young men who believed reputation had to be visible. Bismarck took part in this culture and acquired scars, stories, and a name for unruliness. He was not yet the calculating minister of later legend. He was clever, proud, sociable when he wished to be, and often careless with the ordinary requirements of steady advancement. Berlin did not immediately turn him into a disciplined servant of the Prussian state. He continued legal studies, passed examinations, and entered administrative training. But the bureaucratic path did not hold him with the force his mother had hoped. Government service required patience before superiors, respect for routine, and a willingness to rise by procedure. Bismarck could manage procedure when he needed to, but he did not naturally submit his energy to it. A young man who later mastered state machinery first found its smaller offices suffocating. For a time, he moved through the expected stations of a minor official career, including work connected with the courts and administration. The work was not useless. It gave him familiarity with paperwork, hierarchy, jurisdiction, and the dull but important habits by which a state becomes real in daily life. Yet he did not remain. His father's illness and family circumstances helped draw him back toward estate management, and the official career that might have made him a conventional Prussian bureaucrat loosened before it hardened around him. The crown would later gain a servant of unusual force, partly because the lower rungs of service had failed to absorb him. Kniefhof, one of the family estates in Pomerania, became the setting for a different education. Bismarck managed land, dealt with accounts, supervised agricultural routines, and lived among the expectations of rural nobility. Estate management was not romantic leisure. Grain prices, debts, drainage, labor obligations, timber, livestock, leases, and repairs could make a landowner feel the economy in immediate form. A field that yielded poorly did not become a theory. It became a number in an account book. His reputation during these years was uneven and sometimes wild. Neighbors and acquaintances remembered a young nobleman of enormous vitality, capable of charm and excess, fond of riding, argument, sociability, and provocation. The label later attached to him, the Mad Junker, did not mean madness in the clinical sense. It meant a man too forceful, too unpredictable, and too unwilling to settle into the restrained pattern expected of his class. This miniature of Bismarck at Kinnifoff matters because it shows him before history had given him a public stage, already testing the boundaries of the private one. Even in this rural period, he was not cut off from politics or thought. He read, corresponded, argued, and watched the world beyond the estate. Prussia in the 1830s and 1840s was full of tensions that could reach even those who did not seek them. Questions of constitution, religion, censorship, economic change, and German national feeling passed through newspapers, drawing rooms, provincial assemblies, and official reports. Bismarck did not yet possess a settled program. He possessed instincts, loyalty to monarchy, suspicion of liberal abstractions, contempt for weak talk, and an unusual appetite for the actual workings of power. Religion gradually became part of his formation in a more serious way. Bismarck's connection to Pietist circles, especially through the family of Johanna von Puttkamer, did not make him gentle, nor did it remove his taste for conflict. It gave his conservatism a moral and emotional register deeper than class interest alone. Pietism in Prussian noble circles could join personal faith, household discipline, royal loyalty, and social obligation in one fabric. For Bismarck, whose energies often threatened to scatter, this world offered gravity. Johanna von Puttkamer became central to that steadier life. Their marriage in 1847 joined Bismarck to a family network whose religious seriousness and conservative loyalties suited the direction in which he was moving. His letters to Johanna over the years would show tenderness, dependence, irritation, humor, and self-revelation in measures that complicate the public image of the iron statesman. In private, he could be needy as well as commanding. He could crave loyalty while giving orders to half a continent. The later Chancellor did not replace the husband and father. He carried those private intensities into a public life that rarely admitted softness in its language. Marriage also gave Bismarck a more settled social form just before revolution tested Prussia and the German states. The year 1847 was not a quiet threshold, even if it looked at first like a personal turning point. Prussia had convened the United Diet, drawing representatives of provincial estates into a broader political conversation, though still far from parliamentary sovereignty. Liberals wanted constitutional guarantees, budgets, rights, and participation. Conservatives feared that each concession would open the door to disorder. Bismarck entered that atmosphere as a man whose loyalties had sharpened around crown, faith, land, and hierarchy. There is a temptation to treat these early years as a waiting room before the true story begins. That would miss their usefulness. Bismarck's later statecraft drew heavily on what he had learned before holding great office: the pride of landowners, the vanity of students, the stiffness of bureaucrats, the anxieties of monarchs, the language of religious conservatives, and the practical value of institutions that appeared dull until they became decisive. He did not arrive in politics as a philosopher of nationalism. He arrived as a Prussian nobleman with a deepening sense that the old order would have to fight intelligently if it wished to survive. When revolution came in 1848, it did not meet a neutral observer. It met a man already inclined to distrust crowds, assemblies, and the moral confidence of liberal speech. Yet the revolutionary crisis also gave him something he could not have gained from estate life alone. It gave him a public arena, a set of enemies, and the first chance to discover that words spoken in defense of monarchy could carry him beyond the boundaries of a rural noble's life. The restless Junker from Schönhausen was about to enter the Prussian Assembly, where the old world he loved would be forced to speak in the language of a new political age. Chapter 3: Religion, Rebellion, and the Prussian Assembly. The Prussian Assembly did not create Otto von Bismarck, but it gave his instincts a public language. Before 1848, he had been known among neighbors, family circles, provincial conservatives, and a state society as a forceful and irregular man, not as a figure of national consequence. Revolution changed the scale of his world. Across Europe, old governments found themselves facing crowds, petitions, barricades, newspapers, constitutional demands, and assemblies that claimed to speak for peoples rather than merely for estates or dynasties. In Berlin, the shock reached the Prussian monarchy directly, and Bismarck saw in it not the birth of liberty, but the weakening of the authority he believed held society together. Frederick William IV had never been a simple ruler. He had imagination, religious feeling, historical romanticism, and a deep attachment to monarchy as something sacred rather than contractual. He could speak warmly about German feeling and Christian kingship, yet he recoiled from the idea that a crown could be handed upward by an elected assembly as though sovereignty began with parliamentary consent. This contradiction would matter greatly in 1848 and 1849. The king wanted a renewed order, perhaps even a German order, but not one that made monarchy dependent on revolution. When unrest reached Berlin in March 1848, the monarchy found itself under pressure from a city whose political energy had grown faster than royal confidence. The fighting in the streets, the dead carried before the king, and the sudden concessions that followed shook conservative Prussia at its roots. Bismarck was not in command of events. He was still a provincial nobleman with connections, anger, and a widening sense that the world he trusted could bend under pressure more easily than he had believed. That discovery did not make him cautious in the liberal sense. It made him more alert to weakness. His first instinct was loyalty to the crown, even when the crown itself seemed uncertain. Stories from these days show Bismarck trying to encourage resistance to revolutionary pressure and seeking ways to support royal authority. He would later become famous for flexibility, but his early response to 1848 was not flexible at all. It was defensive, emotional, and rooted in the belief that concession made under street pressure carried a stain no legal formula could wash away. A man who later manipulated parliaments with skill began by distrusting the very atmosphere in which parliaments claimed moral force. The Prussian United Diet had already introduced him to political speech before the full revolutionary crisis broke open. Convened in 1847, it was not a modern national parliament, but it gave representatives from provincial estates a broader stage for grievances and argument. Liberals wanted the state to accept regular constitutional limits, especially over finance and legislation. Conservatives wanted consultation without surrender. Bismarck's interventions placed him among those who defended the monarchy's inherited authority and warned against theories that made the crown dependent on the will of representatives. What made Bismarck noticeable was not moderation. He did not soothe liberal opinion, and he did not try to appear above faction. He spoke as a man who believed that the old Prussian bond between king and subject had a history older than the language of rights being imported from revolutionary Europe. His defense of noble and royal authority could sound severe, but it was not mindless nostalgia. It came from a conviction that the state was not a debating society, and that Prussia's strength had come from discipline, service, and obedience organized around the crown. In the revolutionary months, that conviction placed him near the circle of conservative men who gathered around the king and around the defense of Christian monarchy. Ernst Ludwig von Gerlach, one of the leading conservative influences of the period, belonged to a world in which faith, legitimacy, and royal authority were closely bound. Bismarck moved within that atmosphere, absorbing some of its language while never becoming a mere disciple. He shared its distrust of liberal rationalism and revolutionary sovereignty. Yet, even here, the shape of his mind was more practical than devotional, more interested in power's survival than in doctrine alone. A conservative newspaper world helped give this movement a voice. The Kreuzzeitung and the circles connected to it offered royalist conservatives a means of argument in a public sphere that had widened beyond court and cabinet. Print mattered because the revolution had made political language more immediate. Governments could censor, but they could not pretend that newspapers and pamphlets had no force. Bismarck learned in this environment that public opinion could be fought, not merely ignored, and that conservative politics would have to speak if it wished to endure. The Frankfurt Parliament created a larger German stage for the same conflict. Meeting in the Paulskirche, its deputies attempted to design a united Germany through debate, constitutional theory, and national aspiration. They represented a serious and educated liberal nationalism, not a passing enthusiasm. Many wanted rights, unity, legality, and a national government that would overcome the small state fragmentation of the Confederation. Their difficulty lay in the gap between speech and power. They could draft a constitution, but they did not command the armies of Austria or Prussia. Bismarck watched this effort with suspicion. He had little patience for the idea that professors, lawyers, and deputies could summon Germany into existence by eloquence. Yet the Frankfurt Parliament revealed something even its enemies had to understand. German nationalism was no longer confined to songs, student associations, and private hope. It had entered public procedure. It had minutes, committees, votes, constitutional drafts, and a claim to legitimacy that could not be dismissed as a student disturbance. The question of the imperial crown brought the contradiction to its clearest point. In 1849, the Frankfurt Parliament offered Frederick William IV the crown of a united Germany. The offer carried enormous symbolic weight, but it also carried the source of its own rejection. To accept would mean receiving imperial authority from an elected assembly born of revolution, without the full consent of the German princes, and without the old legitimacy that Frederick William believed monarchy required. He refused. The famous phrasing later attached to the refusal, that he would not take a crown from the gutter, captured the spirit, if not every nuance, of the political moment. For Bismarck, the refusal confirmed much of what he already felt. A Germany made by parliamentary invitation seemed to him unstable, improper, and dangerously dependent on liberal theory. Still, the episode did not merely vindicate him, it educated him. The national question had come close enough to the Prussian throne that no conservative statesman could continue as though it did not exist. If unity could not be made through Frankfurt, another force might one day try to make it through monarchy, army, and diplomacy. This is one of the quieter turning points in Bismarck's development. He did not become a nationalist in 1848. He became a conservative who understood that nationalism could be used. The difference mattered. To the liberal deputies, Germany was a promise of constitutional freedom and national representation. To Bismarck, it would later become a field of power in which Prussia could strengthen itself, isolate Austria, and bind popular feeling to royal authority. His later genius lay partly in accepting the energy of a movement whose ideals he did not share. Prussia's own constitutional settlement after the revolutionary crisis left behind another lesson. The monarchy survived, but it had been forced to grant institutions it would rather have controlled from the start. A constitution remained. A representative chamber existed. Budgets, speeches, parties, newspapers, and public controversy would now be permanent parts of political life. Conservatives could dislike this world, but they had to operate inside it. Bismarck's early speeches had been shaped by resistance to revolution. His later career would be shaped by the more difficult art of ruling through institutions he never fully trusted. The human scale of these changes should not disappear behind the language of constitutions. Men who had once expected politics to remain the business of courts and cabinets now heard provincial lawyers argue about rights, watched newspapers shape reputations, and saw ministers answer pressures that did not come from kings. Noble families discussed events over letters and visits. Officials studied instructions with a new care, because public missteps now traveled faster than before. Even conservative households felt that the old world had acquired new listeners. Bismarck emerged from 1848 and 1849 more visible, more committed, and better prepared for conflict. His defense of monarchy had marked him as a man of the right, but not as a harmless traditionalist. He had shown force, memory, sarcasm, and a willingness to stand against respectable liberal opinion. He had also gained a first education in the limits of pure reaction. The revolution could be defeated, but the forces it revealed could not be placed back exactly where they had been. Prussia, after the revolution, was therefore not the Prussia of Bismarck's childhood. It still had a king, an army, a bureaucracy, estates, churches, and nobles. But it also had a constitution and a political public that expected to be heard. Germany, too, had changed. The Frankfurt Parliament failed, yet it left behind a question that would return in another form. Who, if anyone, could make German unity real? To answer that question, Bismarck would next have to leave the immediate heat of Prussian Assembly politics and enter the colder, slower school of German diplomacy at Frankfurt, where Austria's shadow lay across every formal conversation. Chapter 4: Frankfurt and the Education of a Reactionary. Frankfurt gave Bismarck a different kind of political education from the one he had received in the Prussian Assembly. Berlin had shown him the heat of revolution, the nervousness of monarchy, and the sudden force of public argument. Frankfurt showed him something colder. It showed him the routine by which power could be preserved through procedure, precedents, instructions, delays, and the formal language of a confederation that seemed to move slowly because it had been designed to move slowly. In that room of envoys, the German question did not appear as a song or a barricade or a constitutional dream. It appeared as a diplomatic problem, watched over by Austria. Bismarck arrived at the Federal Diet in 1851, still young in high politics, but already marked as a loyal conservative. The Confederation's assembly met not as a parliament of the German people, but as a gathering of representatives sent by governments. Each envoy carried instructions. Each state guarded its rights. Austria presided, and Prussia, though powerful, had to sit inside a structure that constantly reminded it of another power's seniority. This mattered to Bismarck more than speeches about national honor would have done, because it allowed him to see the practical shape of Prussia's limitation. The Federal Diet had habits that could make politics seem almost ceremonial. Questions passed through committees. Envoys observed rank. Language remained guarded, because a sentence spoken too openly could become a claim a government was not ready to defend. Even disagreements could be softened by the conventions of diplomatic exchange. A modern listener might expect great national questions to announce themselves in dramatic votes, but much of German politics at Frankfurt passed through memoranda, reports, formal replies, and carefully measured refusals. Austria's position within this world was not only written into rules, it was reinforced by habit. The Habsburg monarchy had presided over German affairs for centuries in one form or another, and even after the old Holy Roman Empire had disappeared, Austrian diplomats carried the memory of seniority into the Confederation. They represented a state much larger than its German lands alone. a dynastic empire of many peoples whose rulers wanted German influence without German unification. For Austria, the Confederation was useful because it allowed leadership without surrendering imperial complexity. Prussia's difficulty lay in being too large to accept subordination easily and too cautious to challenge it openly. The kingdom had strength, but strength inside a confederation could be trapped by forms. Bismarck learned this not through theory, but through repetition. A Prussian proposal could be slowed, reframed, or balanced by Austrian influence. Smaller states could be reassured that Vienna protected them from Berlin's weight. The Confederation made Austria appear natural and Prussia appear ambitious, even when Prussia asked only for what its power seemed to justify. At Frankfurt, Bismarck's conservatism began to change its edge. He did not become liberal. He did not embrace the Frankfurt Parliament's old dream of constitutional nationalism. Yet he grew less willing to treat Austria as a conservative partner merely because both powers feared revolution. This was an important separation. Earlier conservatives often imagined that monarchy, religion, and order formed a common front against liberalism. Bismarck came to see that two conservative powers could still be rivals, and that shared fear did not erase conflict over command. His correspondence from these years shows a man watching closely, often with irritation, sometimes with amusement, and increasingly with the sense that Prussia's German policy could not remain deferential forever. Letters mattered because they gave him a place to think in motion. In dispatches and private remarks, he studied personalities, etiquette, pressure, weakness, and the distance between official language and real intent. He was learning how states concealed desire. He was also learning that a statesman who accepted the formal explanation of events would usually arrive too late to shape them. The failure of the Erfurt Union stood behind much of this education. Before Bismarck's appointment to Frankfurt, Joseph von Radowitz had tried to build a Prussian-led union after the collapse of the 1848 revolutionary moment. The plan sought a more limited German unity under Prussian guidance, but it lacked the firmness needed to survive Austrian resistance and Russian disapproval. By 1850, Prussia retreated at Olmütz, accepting a settlement that restored the old confederation under Austrian presidency. Liberals remembered it as disappointment. Many Prussians remembered it as humiliation. Olmütz left a deep mark on Prussian political memory because it showed the cost of ambition unsupported by readiness. Prussia had tried to move and then stepped back. It had spoken of leadership and then submitted to a diplomatic settlement arranged under pressure. Bismarck did not draw from this the liberal lesson that Prussia needed parliamentary nationalism. He drew a harsher lesson. If Prussia ever confronted Austria again, it would need allies, timing, military strength, and a cause that made Austria appear as the obstacle rather than the guardian of Germany. Frankfurt therefore became a school of patience. Bismarck's later reputation often makes him seem like a man of sudden strokes, but the foundation of those strokes lay in years of watching slow obstruction. He observed how status worked when no cannon was firing. He saw how an agenda could be shaped before a decision was reached. He learned that a power could dominate a room by making its leadership seem normal. In later years, when he moved against Austria, he would not be moving against an abstraction. He would be moving against habits he had studied face to face. There was also a social education in Frankfurt. Diplomacy in the mid-19th century depended on dinners, visits, personal tone, and the careful management of insult. Bismarck, who could be blunt to the point of rudeness, learned to use bluntness as an instrument rather than merely a temperament. He did not always smooth himself into the expected form. Sometimes the refusal to be polished carried its own message. A Prussian envoy who declined to play every inherited game by Austrian rules could make irritation serve policy. His relationship to German nationalism remained complicated. He still distrusted the liberal and parliamentary nationalism that had failed in 1848 and 1849, but he could see that national feeling might become useful if Prussia could command it without being commanded by it. The smaller states feared Prussian absorption, and many liberals distrusted Prussian militarism. Austria, meanwhile, could not become the simple leader of a German nation without endangering its own non-German empire. Between those facts lay an opening that did not yet have a full plan attached to it. The Crimean War in the 1850s widened Bismarck's diplomatic horizon. Austria and Russia, once conservative partners against revolution, moved apart under the strain of the conflict. Prussia remained cautious, and Bismarck's views during the crisis showed his preference for Prussian interest over sentimental loyalty to conservative alignment. This was not yet the famous Realpolitik of later shorthand, but it pointed in that direction. He was becoming less interested in whether a government was ideologically kindred and more interested in whether its position helped or hindered Prussia. Such thinking separated him from some older conservatives, men who had valued the Holy Alliance spirit, Christian monarchy, and anti-revolutionary solidarity could find Bismarck's coldness unsettling. He did not abandon monarchy, faith, or aristocratic loyalty, but he increasingly refused to let them dictate alliances in a mechanical way. A conservative state, in his mind, still had to survive among other states. Survival required judgment, and judgment could not be replaced by shared slogans. By the late 1850s, Bismarck had become more than a provincial reactionary sent to defend Prussian interests. He had become a diplomat with a sharper sense of Austria's vulnerability and Prussia's unfinished strength. Service in St. Petersburg and later Paris would broaden his view further, placing him among Russian and French calculations as well as German ones. Yet Frankfurt remained the formative station. It taught him that the German Confederation was not a neutral framework. It was a structure of power, and Austria sat at its center because the structure had been made to keep it there. For Prussia to alter that structure, speeches would not be enough. Neither would resentment. The kingdom would need a stronger army, a government willing to endure constitutional conflict, and a monarch who could be persuaded that hesitation might be more dangerous than risk. Frankfurt had shown Bismarck the wall. The next crisis would show whether Prussia possessed the tools to move it, and those tools would first be argued over not on a battlefield, but in the bitter dispute over the army and the budget. Chapter 5. The King, the Army, and the Broken Budget. The Prussian army question began as a matter of organization, but it soon became a test of who possessed authority inside the state. After the revolutions of 1848, Prussia had a constitution, a representative chamber, and a political public that could no longer be treated as a passing disturbance. The crown remained strong, the bureaucracy remained disciplined, and the officer corps still carried old prestige. Yet budgets had to be voted, laws had to be argued, and ministers had to face men who believed that taxation gave representatives a right to shape the government's course. In this space between royal command and parliamentary consent, Bismarck's path to power opened. William I had not been born to expect this role. As the younger brother of Frederick William IV, he had spent much of his life as a prince of the army, shaped by discipline, uniform, service, and a stern understanding of monarchy. The revolutions had marked him harshly. Liberals remembered him as a symbol of military reaction, and for a time in 1848 he had been unpopular enough to leave Berlin. When he became regent in 1858 and then king in 1861, he brought with him the conviction that Prussia's army was not merely one institution among others. It was the spine of the monarchy. The army, in William's mind, have to be made stronger and more reliable. Prussia's population had grown since the earlier military arrangements had been created, But the army's structure had not expanded in proportion. Reformers around the king wanted more regular regiments, longer active service, and a reduced reliance on the Landwehr, the citizen reserve force whose memory was tied to the wars of liberation against Napoleon. To liberals, the Landwehr carried a patriotic and civic meaning. To many conservatives and professional soldiers, it seemed less dependable than the regular army. Behind the technical dispute lay two different images of the state. Albrecht von Roon became the minister most closely associated with the reform program. He wanted a larger army, organized more directly under royal and professional control, with a clearer separation between the regular forces and the older civic associations of the Landwehr. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the General Staff, represented another part of the transformation. He did not make speeches in the same way politicians did, but he helped shape a military system that valued planning, railways, maps, staff work, and the coordination of movement over large distances. War, in Prussian hands, was becoming an administrative science as well as a field command. For the liberal majority in the Prussian House of Representatives, the reform raised constitutional questions that could not be dismissed as mere obstruction. The army required money. Money required budget approval. If the king and ministers could reorganize the army without the chamber's consent, then the constitution's financial powers would be weakened at the very point where they mattered most. Liberals were not necessarily opposed to a stronger Prussia, and many were German nationalists who wanted Prussia to lead. They feared, however, that a strengthened army under unchecked royal authority would make constitutional government ornamental. The budget conflict hardened because both sides saw principle in what might otherwise have looked like administration. William I regarded resistance as an attack on the army and therefore on the crown. Liberal deputies regarded royal insistence as a refusal to accept constitutional life after 1848. Ministers came and went. Negotiations failed, and the government struggled to find a stable path between reform and legality. Prussia had become too constitutional to ignore Parliament, but not constitutional enough for Parliament to command the ministry. The machinery could still move, but it ground heavily at the point where sovereignty was disputed. Bismarck watched this conflict from diplomatic postings, but he was not distant from its meaning. His years at Frankfurt had taught him that Prussia could not challenge Austria or reshape Germany without stronger instruments. His time in St. Petersburg and Paris had broadened his sense of European calculation, yet the central fact remained Prussian. A state that wanted to alter the German order would need an army whose readiness did not depend on liberal approval at each decisive moment. The army question therefore joined domestic conflict to foreign possibility. William I considered abdication when the crisis seemed impossible to resolve. This was no small threat. In a monarchy built around duty, abdication could appear both as personal escape and constitutional disaster. The king did not want to surrender the reform, but he also did not want to govern as though legality had become meaningless. His ministers could not settle the matter. The liberals would not give way on the budget without guarantees. The old forms of authority had reached a point where they needed a man willing to bear public blame. Bismarck was that man, though not everyone at court welcomed the thought. He had a reputation for force, intelligence, and danger. Conservatives who wanted firmness could admire him. Cautious men could fear what his firmness might cost. His appointment as minister-president in September 1862 brought into office a politician who had long defended monarchy, but whose methods were not those of a merely obedient court servant. He did not intend to flatter Parliament into submission. He intended to survive it. His appearance before the Budget Committee soon gave history the phrase most closely attached to his rise. Bismarck argued that the great questions of the time would not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions, but by blood and iron. The phrase became larger than the moment, repeated so often that it can obscure the speech around it. He was not announcing a love of violence for its own sake. He was saying, with deliberate severity, that power would decide questions that parliamentary language had failed to settle. In the room itself, the statement was part warning, part diagnosis, and part declaration of temperament. The immediate issue remained the budget. Bismarck's government adopted the position that because the constitution did not clearly provide for what should happen when Crown, upper chamber, and lower chamber failed to agree on a budget, the state could continue collecting taxes and spending money according to the previous arrangement. This so-called gap theory gave legal clothing to a political decision. It did not persuade liberals, who saw it as a violation of constitutional government. It did, however, allow the army reform to proceed. For several years, Prussia was governed through this unresolved conflict. Taxes were collected, reforms continued, and the liberal majority protested without being able to remove the ministry. The situation revealed the unusual structure of Prussian constitutionalism. The chamber had voice, publicity, and budgetary claim, but the ministers answered to the king. The king possessed executive authority, but he could not easily erase the fact that elected representatives now stood in the path of government. Bismarck used the ambiguity. He did not resolve it at once. This was one of his most important political habits. He could live inside an unresolved situation longer than his opponents expected. Liberals often assumed that contradiction would force concession, because constitutional logic seemed to point in their direction. Bismarck understood that institutions do not move by logic alone. They move through offices, orders, salaries, loyalties, habits, and the willingness of men in authority to endure denunciation. A deadlock that embarrassed one side could become a working arrangement for the other. Public opinion did not disappear under this pressure. Newspapers attacked the government. Deputies defended constitutional rights. Liberals won elections and continued to speak in the name of legality. Bismarck did not possess the broad national popularity he would later gain after military victories. In these early ministerial years, he was widely hated by liberal Prussia, distrusted by many moderates, and regarded as the hard face of royal resistance. That isolation mattered because it shows how little his later authority was inevitable. Before triumph made him appear far-sighted, he looked to many like a reactionary gambling with the state. Yet the army reform continued, and in that continuation lay the future of German unification. Roon's administrative work, Moltke's staff system, and the king's persistence gave Prussia a military instrument stronger than it had possessed when Olmütz exposed its weakness. Barracks, recruitment schedules, officer training, railway planning, and budget lines formed the hidden structure beneath later victories. The famous wars of the 1860s did not begin with battlefield inspiration. They began with paperwork defended against Parliament. Bismarck's relationship with William of Warsaw began to settle into its peculiar form. The king was no puppet. He had convictions of his own, and he cared deeply about the army's honor and the monarchy's dignity. Bismarck served him with loyalty, but not with softness. He could press, argue, threaten resignation, and use the king's own sense of duty to keep policy moving. Their partnership depended on trust, strain, and the fact that each man gave the other something he needed. William gave Bismarck legitimacy. Bismarck gave William a government capable of surviving conflict. The liberals misread him in one crucial respect. They saw his contempt for parliamentary majorities and assumed that he belonged entirely to the past. In many loyalties, he did, but his method was not old-fashioned. He understood newspapers, public emotion, constitutional ambiguity, military modernization, and the usefulness of national feeling. He did not want Parliament to rule, but he knew that Parliament existed. He did not worship public opinion, but he knew it could be guided, divided, and later reconciled to power, if power produced success. Prussia in 1862 and 1863 therefore stood in a tense half-light. Its government was accused of violating constitutional principles. Its army was being strengthened. Its king felt both burdened and vindicated. Its liberal opposition waited for legality to defeat ministerial stubbornness. Outside Prussia, the German Confederation still rested under Austria's formal presidency, and the smaller states still feared Prussian ambition. Bismarck had not yet unified anything. He had only secured the means by which Prussia might act when a question large enough appeared. That question came from the north, from the tangled rights of Schleswig and Holstein, where dynastic law, German feeling, Danish policy, and Prussian opportunity met in one difficult dispute. The army made stronger through the broken budget would soon be used beyond Prussia's borders. Bismarck's constitutional gamble at home had prepared him for a diplomatic gamble abroad, and the first test would begin with duchies whose names had troubled German politics long before they became the opening move in a larger design. Chapter 6: Blood, Iron, and the Danish Question. Schleswig and Holstein had troubled German politics long before Bismarck turned them into an instrument of Prussian policy. They were not ordinary provinces waiting for a simple national decision. Holstein belonged to the German Confederation, while Schleswig did not, and both were tied in complicated ways to the Danish crown. Their populations, laws, dynastic claims, and political expectations overlapped without fitting neatly into one principle. To German nationalists, the duchies competition seemed to contain German rights endangered by Denmark. To Danish national liberals, they touched the integrity of the monarchy and the future of the Danish state. The legal tangle mattered because 19th century Europe still took dynastic law seriously. A ruler's right to a territory could depend on inheritance rules, treaties, estate privileges, and understandings that had accumulated over generations. The duchies had their own traditions and relationships to the Danish monarchy, and many German observers insisted that Schleswig and Holstein should remain linked together. Denmark's attempt to draw Schleswig more closely into the Danish constitutional structure appeared, to many Germans, as a violation of that older connection. The question could sound technical, but technical questions often become dangerous when they carry national feeling. Christian IX came to the Danish throne in 1863, after the death of Frederick VII, and the succession sharpened the problem. The November Constitution sought to bind Schleswig more firmly to Denmark, and German opinion reacted strongly. Across the German states, the duchies became a cause through which nationalists could speak of German honor without yet confronting the larger question of unity. Smaller states, liberal patriots, and conservative governments did not all want the same outcome, but they could agree that Denmark had created a crisis. This gave Bismarck useful material. A cause that belonged emotionally to German nationalism could be handled diplomatically by Prussia. Bismarck did not approach the duchies as a sentimental German patriot. He understood the excitement they stirred, but he was more interested in what the crisis could do to the structure of power inside Germany. If Prussia acted alone, it might alarm other German states and give Austria a reason to resist. If Prussia acted with Austria, the two great powers could defeat Denmark together while leaving unresolved the question of who would benefit from victory. The alliance with Austria therefore contained its own future fracture. It looked conservative, legal, and cooperative at first, which made it more useful. Austria had reasons to join the action. It could not allow Prussia to appear as the sole defender of German rights, and it wished to preserve its standing inside the Confederation. By acting beside Prussia, Austria could restrain Prussian ambition while sharing in the diplomatic credit. Bismarck accepted this partnership with a patience that concealed its deeper danger. He knew that a joint success might create a joint possession, and joint possessions between rivals often become disputes over management. The duchies offered not only a war against Denmark, but a way to bring Austria into a position where disagreement would become easier to expose. The Second Schleswig War began in 1864. Prussian and Austrian forces moved against Denmark, whose position was weaker than patriotic feeling in Copenhagen had wished to believe. The campaign included military operations that later accounts often reduced to the storming of the Danish defences at Diebel. But the wider meaning lay in the imbalance between a smaller northern monarchy and the combined pressure of two German great powers. Bismarck did not need the war to become heroic. He needed it to be legitimate, limited, and successful enough to shift the diplomatic ground. Diebel became the best-known military moment of the conflict. Danish defences there had symbolic weight because they stood for resistance against German demands. But symbolism could not compensate for Prussian artillery, organization, and numbers. The fall of the position weakened Denmark's ability to bargain. Later, the crossing to Als and the continued pressure made the outcome harder to escape. The violence itself need not be lingered over to understand its consequence. Denmark was forced towards settlement, and the duchies passed out of Danish control. The Treaty of Vienna in October 1864 ended the war and transferred Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to the joint authority of Prussia and Austria. On paper, this arrangement seemed to satisfy the victorious powers while postponing final decisions. In practice, it created precisely the sort of unsettled structure Bismarck could use. Schleswig lay closer to Prussian strategic interests, especially because of its position near the Baltic and North Sea approaches. Holstein, as a member of the German Confederation, carried different legal and political implications. Lauenburg would soon be handled separately, leaving the larger problem intact. Joint administration required procedure. Officials had to govern territory, collect information, manage local expectations, and answer competing instructions from Berlin and Vienna. Prussia and Austria could agree that Denmark had lost, but agreement became thinner when the question turned to the future of the duchies. German liberals often hoped for the claims of the Duke of Augustenburg, who seemed to represent a national solution outside direct Prussian annexation. Bismarck had little desire to strengthen a new medium-sized German ruler if Prussia could gain strategic advantage instead. The Duke of Augustenburg's claim gave the crisis another layer. Many German patriots supported him because his candidacy seemed to respect the rights of the duchies and the national cause. Bismarck regarded that enthusiasm with suspicion. A new duchy under Augustenburg might satisfy liberal feeling while denying Prussia control of military and naval positions it considered valuable. He did not dismiss law, but he did not treat legal sympathy as a reason for Prussia to lose the fruit of its action. The duchies had become too important to be surrendered to a romantic solution. Bismarck's handling of Schleswig-Holstein showed the difference between using nationalism and serving it. He allowed German indignation against Denmark to build pressure. He allowed the cause of the duchies to draw Austria into cooperation. He allowed legal complexity to keep the settlement from closing too soon. Yet, at each stage, he measured the question by Prussian interest. National language filled the air around the dispute, but the hand that sorted the options was that of a Prussian minister-president still governing at home without a settled budget. The Prussian army's role in the war also changed the domestic atmosphere. Liberals who had opposed Bismarck over the army reforms could not entirely ignore the fact that the strengthened military instrument had now produced a national success. This did not heal the constitutional conflict, but it weakened the simplicity of the liberal case. A government they accused of illegality had defended a German cause more effectively than parliamentary nationalism had managed in 1848. Success began to alter the moral weather around power. Austria's position became more uncomfortable after the victory. It had helped defeat Denmark, but it could not easily convert the result into leadership. If it supported Augustenberg, it would gain liberal applause in some German circles while irritating Prussia. If it compromised with Prussia, it might appear to surrender German rights to Prussian appetite. The Confederation, whose procedures had long protected Austria's influence, now became one of the arenas in which the duchy's future could be contested. Bismarck had brought the old rival into a problem where every solution carried cost. The Gastein Convention of 1865 tried to manage the tension. It assigned Prussia the administration of Schleswig and Austria the administration of Holstein, while Prussia acquired Lauenburg. The arrangement looked like a practical division of responsibilities, and for a short time it reduced immediate friction. Its deeper effect was different. By separating administrative control while leaving the underlying sovereignty question unsettled, it placed Prussia and Austria beside each other in a narrow corridor of future dispute. The settlement did not close the Danish question. It moved the German question one step nearer to confrontation. Bismarck's achievement in the Danish crisis was not that he solved Schleswig-Holstein. It was that he prevented anyone else from solving it in a way that blocked Prussia. He had used a legitimate grievance, a conservative alliance, and a successful war to produce an unresolved settlement favorable to his next move. The smaller German states could still speak of legality and national rights. Austria could still claim its place as co-victor. Prussia, however, now had troops, administration, and strategic interest embedded in the duchies themselves. The crisis also revealed a feature of Bismarck's method that would appear again. He preferred political conditions in which his opponent had some formal ground to stand on, but not enough practical ground to move freely. Austria in Holstein had rights, but those rights could be made to look obstructive. German liberals had sympathies, but those sympathies could be divided from what Prussia called necessity. Denmark had lost, but its defeat had opened a wider German struggle rather than ending one. Bismarck's settlements often contained the next question folded inside them. In Berlin, the minister-president remained under constitutional criticism, yet his position had grown stronger. William I had seen the army vindicated in action. Roon's reforms had gained visible purpose. Moltke's military system had shown what planning and organization could accomplish. The liberals could still object to the broken budget, but the language of national achievement now complicated the accusation. Bismarck did not yet possess reconciliation with Parliament, but victory had given him leverage that argument alone could never have supplied. Schleswig and Holstein therefore became more than borderlands wrested from Denmark. They became the hinge between Prussia's internal army crisis and its coming struggle with Austria. The dispute that had begun in dynastic law and national feeling now pointed toward the central question Bismarck had learned at Frankfurt: whether Austria would continue to preside over German affairs, or whether Prussia would force a new order into being. The answer would come not through the slow procedures of the Federal Diet, but through the brief and decisive war that led to Königgrätz. Chapter 7: Königgrätz and the War against Austria. In the summer of 1866, the old German order finally reached the point that Frankfurt diplomacy had long postponed. Prussia and Austria had defeated Denmark together, but the shared victory left them holding a problem neither could settle without weakening the other. Schleswig and Holstein had become more than duchies. They had become a test of whether Austria could still preside over German affairs, or whether Prussia could force German politics to obey a new center. The dispute that followed looked, in formal language, like a quarrel over administration and legality. Beneath that language stood the question Bismarck had carried since Frankfurt. Austria still possessed dignity, tradition, and a wide circle of German sympathies. Many smaller states distrusted Prussia more than Vienna, partly because Austrian leadership usually felt less likely to swallow them whole. Prussia, by contrast, appeared sharper, more impatient, and more directly threatening to the independence of other German rulers. Bismarck understood this suspicion. He did not need the smaller states to love Prussia. He needed Austria to appear as the obstacle to a settlement that Prussia could claim to be offering in the name of German reform. The quarrel over Holstein gave him the opening. Austria administered Holstein under the Gastein arrangement, and Prussia administered Schleswig, but the arrangement had never removed the larger issue of sovereignty. When Austria brought the duchies question before the Federal Diet, Bismarck treated the move as a breach of the bilateral understanding between the two powers. The legal argument mattered because it allowed Prussia to present escalation as response. A war for German leadership could not be announced so plainly at the beginning. It had to enter through a doorway of procedure. Bismarck also worked to shape the wider diplomatic field before the conflict began. Italy wanted Venetia, which Austria still held, and an alliance with Prussia gave Italy reason to join the pressure against Vienna. Russia, still remembering Austria's conduct during the Crimean War, was not inclined to rescue the Habsburg position with warmth. France, under Napoleon III, watched for compensation and influence, but did not immediately move to prevent the clash. Britain remained distant. Bismarck's purpose was to keep the war limited enough that Prussia could fight Austria without facing Europe. Inside Prussia, the coming conflict carried enormous risk. The army reforms defended through the budget crisis would now be tested against the other great German power. William I did not enter the prospect lightly. Many conservatives still regarded Austria as a legitimate monarchy, not a natural enemy. Liberal nationalists, who wanted German unity, did not all trust the Prussian government that claimed to advance it. Bismarck had made himself necessary to the king, but he had not made himself beloved. A defeat would have destroyed him. Moltke's military planning gave Prussia a practical confidence that politics alone could not supply. The Prussian General Staff had studied mobilization, railway movement, and the coordination of separate armies with a seriousness that reflected years of institutional discipline. Railways were not decorative symbols of modernity in this campaign. They allowed men, horses, equipment, and supplies to be moved with timing that older armies had struggled to achieve. The staff map and the railway timetable had become instruments of power. The Prussian infantry also carried the Dres needlegun, a breech-loading rifle that could be fired more rapidly than the muzzle-loading weapons still used by many Austrian troops. Its value was not magical, and no weapon alone decided the war. Training, command, movement, and morale all mattered. Still, the needlegun gave Prussian soldiers a material advantage in the conditions where infantry fire shaped the outcome. Technical detail became political consequence once the campaign began. Austria's army had brave soldiers and experienced commanders, but its system moved with heavier burdens. The empire's military responsibilities stretched across a vast dynastic state, and its political leadership had to think about Italy as well as Bohemia. Ludwig von Benedek, who commanded Austrian forces in the north, had not sought that role with confidence. The Habsburg monarchy was not weak in a simple sense. It was overextended, and in 1866, overextension became visible. The war itself moved quickly. Prussian forces advanced into Bohemia in separate armies, intending to converge against the Austrians. Moltke's plan required coordination across distance, and that always carried danger, because separated armies could be defeated before they joined. Yet the Prussian movements held together well enough to bring the decisive battle near Königgrätz, also known as Sadowa, on the 3rd of July. There, The contest between two German great powers reached its military answer. Königgrätz did not need to last long to alter Europe. Austrian forces fought under heavy pressure, and Prussian firepower, movement, and the arrival of the Crown Prince's army helped determine the day. The battle left Austria defeated in the field and Prussia suddenly standing in a position that had seemed almost unreachable only weeks before. The old confederation could not survive the result. The question now was not whether Prussia had won, but what Bismarck would allow victory to become. This was one of the most important moments in his career. At court and in the army, some wanted a harder settlement. Vienna lay open as a symbolic objective. Austria could be punished, humiliated, perhaps stripped further. William I himself felt the emotions of victory and the claims of military honor. Bismarck resisted this pressure because his aim had never been to destroy Austria. He wanted Austria excluded from German affairs, not driven into permanent revenge or forced into an alliance with France. The miniature of Bismarck after Königgrätz is therefore not a scene of triumph, but one of restraint under strain. He argued against marching on Vienna and against terms that would make future peace harder. He understood that Austria, if treated with enough moderation, might accept exclusion from Germany while remaining a conservative power with which Prussia could later coexist. This was not mercy in the sentimental sense. It was calculation with a long horizon. A crushed Austria would be a danger. A defeated Austria could be a neighbor. The Peace of Prague in August 1866 reflected that discipline. Austria gave up its role in German affairs, and the German Confederation came to an end. Prussia annexed several states that had sided against it, including Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and Frankfurt. These annexations strengthened Prussia's territorial continuity and removed obstacles between its older lands and western provinces. The map began to look less like a scattered inheritance and more like a state capable of leading northern Germany. The treatment of Austria itself remained comparatively moderate. Venetia passed to Italy, though through French mediation, and Austria withdrew from the German question. The Habsburg monarchy suffered a serious defeat, but it was not dismantled. Within a year, Austria would turn inward toward the compromise with Hungary that created Austria-Hungary. German leadership had passed away from Vienna, yet the empire survived in another form, carrying its own tensions into the later century. Prussia's victory also transformed the domestic budget conflict. The army that liberals had resisted funding had delivered the very national success many liberals desired. Bismarck now moved toward reconciliation through the Indemnity Bill, asking Parliament to approve retroactively the spending that had occurred without a legal budget. This was a shrewd settlement. It allowed liberals to support the national achievement without openly admitting that constitutional principle had been defeated. It allowed Bismarck to legalize the past without apologizing for the method. The liberal movement split under the pressure of success. Some remained opposed to Bismarck's authoritarian handling of the constitution. Others, especially national liberals, chose to work with him because Prussian power now seemed to be accomplishing what liberal nationalism had failed to achieve in 1848. This shift mattered almost as much as the military victory. Bismarck had begun the decade as the enemy of liberal respectability. After Königgrätz, he became the man through whom many liberals hoped German unity might actually be made. Austria's exclusion changed the meaning of Germany. The old question had often been framed as whether Germany would be led by Austria, by Prussia, or by some broader constitutional arrangement. After 1866, one of those answers disappeared. A smaller Germany without Austria, a Kleindeutsch solution, now became practical. It did not yet include the southern kingdoms, and it did not yet have an emperor. But the main obstacle that had stood over the federal diet since 1815 had been removed in a single campaign. Bismarck's restraint after victory gave his achievement a durable form. Had he pursued humiliation for its own sake, Prussia might have gained more in the moment and lost more in the years that followed. Instead, he converted military success into a political settlement narrow enough to hold. Austria was out. Northern Germany was open. The king's army had been vindicated. Parliament had been forced toward accommodation, and the next task was no longer the destruction of the Confederation. It was the construction of something that looked almost like an empire, while still pretending not to be one. Chapter 8. The Confederation that was almost an empire. After Königgrätz, Prussia had to turn victory into a structure. Austria was out of German affairs. The old German Confederation had been dissolved, and several states that had stood against Prussia had been annexed. Yet Bismarck did not immediately proclaim a German empire. He moved with more care than triumphal language usually suggests, because the northern German lands could be reorganized under Prussian leadership, while the southern kingdoms still required caution. The question was no longer whether Prussia could break the old order. It was whether Prussia could build a new one without frightening every remaining German ruler into resistance. The North German Confederation emerged from that need. It gathered the states north of the main river into a federal structure dominated by Prussia, but not described as a simple Prussian annexation. This distinction mattered. Many Germans wanted unity, but not all wanted to become provincial subjects of Berlin. Rulers of smaller states wished to preserve dignity. Cabinets, courts, local laws, and visible signs of sovereignty. Bismarck understood that political absorption could be made easier when it appeared as federation rather than conquest. Prussia's annexations after the war had already changed the map in practical ways. Hanover, Hesse, Kassel, Nassau, and the free city of Frankfurt were taken into Prussia, strengthening the kingdom's western connection and reducing the broken shape that had troubled it since 1815. Frankfurt's annexation had a special weight because the old federal diet had met there, and the city had carried the memory of German political procedure before Prussian victory ended that world. The place where envoys had once guarded the balance of the Confederation now belonged to the power that had overturned it. The remaining northern states were not erased in the same way. They entered a new federal arrangement whose constitution gave them a place, though not an equal power. Bismarck's skill lay in designing forms that could include local governments while preserving Prussian command at the center. The old Confederation had protected the independence of states by making central authority weak. The new Confederation protected the appearance of federal partnership while making central authority far more effective. It was an answer to Frankfurt, Olmütz, and 1848 at the same time. The Constitution of 1867 deserves attention because it shows Bismarck's unusual comfort with mixed instruments. He did not design a purely reactionary system, though he remained hostile to parliamentary government in the liberal sense. The Confederation had a Reichstag elected by universal male suffrage, broader than what many liberals would have expected from a conservative Prussian minister. It also had a Bundesrat, representing the governments of the member states. Above both stood the Prussian king as federal president, while Bismarck served as chancellor, responsible to the monarch rather than to the elected chamber. This arrangement placed modern political energy inside a controlled frame. Universal male suffrage gave the national legislature a democratic surface and helped Bismarck appeal beyond the older liberal middle class. He believed that rural voters, conservative instincts, and loyalty to monarchy might balance the urban liberals who had fought him over the budget. The calculation was not foolish, though it did not always work as cleanly as he hoped. Mass politics could be useful to a conservative statesman, but it could not be made obedient forever. The Bundesrat gave the governments of the states a formal role in legislation and administration. Prussia's weight within it was decisive, yet the existence of the body reassured rulers who did not want the federation to become a naked unitary state. Smaller governments could send representatives, participate in committees, and claim that their sovereignty had not disappeared. Procedure softened subordination. A vote in a federal council could make Prussian leadership look like collective decision. The miniature of the constitution's making is best understood through its machinery rather than through a single dramatic room. Bismarck took the materials available to him after 1866 and arranged them so that different audiences could see different things. Liberals could see a national parliament. Princes could see a federal council. The Prussian king could see authority preserved. The army could see centralized command. Foreign governments could see a northern federation rather than an empire claiming all Germans at once. Military authority stood near the center of the design. The federal army was effectively organized under Prussian leadership, which meant that the central question of the earlier budget struggle had now been lifted from Prussian domestic politics into the structure of northern Germany. The army reforms that had nearly broken constitutional life in Berlin became part of a wider national order. What had been defended against parliament inside Prussia now served as the armed foundation of the Confederation. The state Bismarck was building rested on rifles, railways, recruitment, and law. Liberal nationalists faced a difficult choice. Many had spent years opposing Bismarck as the enemy of constitutional principle. Now he had defeated Austria, reorganized northern Germany, and created a national parliament. Some liberals continued to distrust him, and with reason, because the Chancellor did not accept ministerial responsibility to the Reichstag. Others chose cooperation, forming the National Liberal Support that would help pass many measures of unification and legal integration. Their decision did not mean they had forgotten 1862. It meant success had changed the cost of opposition. In the new confederation, law became one of the quieter tools of unity. Common citizenship, commercial rules, postal arrangements, military obligations, and administrative coordination gradually gave northern Germany a more coherent shape. These measures lacked the grandeur of battlefield victories, but they altered how people encountered authority. A trader, a conscript, a lawyer, or a newspaper editor did not need to see unity proclaimed in marble to feel its reach. The Federation entered ordinary life through regulations and offices. The Zollverein also remained important. Long before political unity became possible, the customs union had accustomed many German states to economic cooperation under Prussian influence. After 1866, its role became even more closely tied to the political future, especially because the southern German states still belonged to its economic orbit. Customs policy created a connection that borders and dynastic caution had not erased. Bismarck could afford to wait in part because trade had already made parts of Germany think together. Southern Germany was the unresolved question. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and the southern portion of Hesse-Darmstadt did not join the North German Confederation in 1867. Their rulers and populations had their own traditions, Catholic loyalties, military arrangements, and fears of Prussian dominance. Open pressure might have pushed them away or invited foreign interference. Bismarck therefore accepted a divided Germany for the time being. He had learned the value of leaving a settlement unfinished when completion required the right crisis. Secret defensive treaties tied the southern states to Prussia in case of war. These agreements were not public declarations of unity, but they mattered more than many public speeches. If France attacked, or if a crisis could be framed as defensive, southern armies would stand with Prussia. The treaties gave Bismarck a hidden bridge between the Northern Federation and a future empire. They also allowed southern rulers to preserve outward independence, while binding their military future to Berlin. The line of the main river therefore became both boundary and pause. North of it, Prussia had built a federation. South of it, German states remained separate, but connected by economics, diplomacy, and military promises. France watched this arrangement with concern, because even the partial unification of northern Germany strengthened Prussia beyond what Napoleon III had expected to tolerate easily. Austria had been excluded. France had not yet been answered. The European balance was adjusting around a new German fact. Bismarck's achievement in these years was deliberately incomplete. He did not force every German question to resolution at once. The lesser statesman might have mistaken victory over Austria for permission to demand everything immediately. Bismarck instead built a form that could function in the present and expand under pressure in the future. The North German Confederation was almost an empire because it already contained many imperial mechanisms. It lacked only the southern states, the imperial title, and the crisis that would make both acceptable. Inside Prussia, the old constitutional conflict had not vanished, but it had been transformed. The Indemnity Bill allowed a settlement over the earlier budget struggle, and the National Liberals entered a period of cooperation with the government. Bismarck did not become a parliamentary minister. He became a chancellor who could use parliament without submitting to it. In this sense, the Confederation carried his political character into institutional form. It was national without being liberal, federal without being weak, modern without being democratic in the full ministerial sense. The new structure also changed Bismarck himself. He was no longer only the minister who had defied the Prussian Landtag or the diplomat who had humbled Austria. He had become the organizer of a German state in everything but name. Yet, the very success of the Confederation made the remaining problem more visible. A northern Germany under Prussian leadership could not settle permanently beside independent southern kingdoms. French anxiety and the memory of unfinished national aspiration. The next movement would not begin in a constitutional committee. It would begin with a Spanish throne, a telegram from Ems, and the French fear that Prussia's almost empire might soon become whole. Chapter 9. Ems, Sedan, and the French road to Versailles. A telegram from Ems became famous because it made visible how little distance remained between diplomacy and war. The crisis did not begin with the telegram, and it did not begin with a battlefield. It began with a throne in Spain, a vacancy in Madrid, and the possibility that a prince from the Catholic branch of the Hohenzollern family might become king there. To many Germans, this sounded distant from the work Bismarck had already done in northern Germany. To Napoleon III and his ministers, it raised a more dangerous image: Prussian influence pressing France from the east, while a related dynasty stood beyond the Pyrenees. France had watched Prussia's rise with increasing unease. The defeat of Austria in 1866 had been too quick, too decisive, and too poorly compensated from the French point of view. Napoleon III had hoped to preserve French influence by mediating, balancing, or gaining something from the rearrangement of Germany, but Bismarck had emerged with northern Germany organized under Prussian leadership and the southern states tied to Berlin by secret military agreements. A France that had once expected to arbitrate German weakness now faced a Prussia whose strength had become the central fact of the continent. The Spanish candidacy gave French anxiety a specific form. Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen was not the Prussian crown prince, and the Hohenzollern connection did not mean Spain would become a Prussian province. Diplomatic fear rarely waits for such simplicity. French ministers saw prestige, encirclement, and public humiliation bound together. If France accepted a Hohenzollern king in Spain after failing to gain compensation in the German settlement, Napoleon III's empire might look weaker at home and abroad. Bismarck understood that the appearance of French weakness could matter almost as much as military weakness. At first, the candidacy moved through guarded channels. Bismarck had reason to welcome it, though he did not need to own it too visibly. A French overreaction could make France appear aggressive, while a Prussian retreat could be avoided if the affair were handled carefully. William I, older and more cautious than his minister-president, did not seek war for its own sake. The king's instinct often leaned toward restraint when dynastic honor and European peace were both at stake. Between the king's caution and Bismarck's calculation lay the space in which the crisis sharpened. French diplomacy pressed hard against the candidacy. Under pressure, Leopold withdrew, and for a moment the immediate danger seemed to lessen. Had the matter ended there, France might have claimed success and Prussia might have stepped away without fighting. Yet politics in Paris demanded more than withdrawal. Napoleon III's government wanted a guarantee that the Hohenzollern candidacy would not be renewed. It was this additional demand, directed toward King William himself, that moved the affair from diplomatic pressure into the territory of royal dignity. The meeting at Ems was not arranged as a theatrical confrontation. William I was taking the waters at the spa town, a setting of health routines, promenades, and courtly access rather than cabinet crisis. Count Benedetti, the French ambassador, approached him there and asked for assurances beyond the withdrawal already obtained. The king refused to give a permanent guarantee, but he did so politely. The exchange ended without a public insult in the immediate human sense. Its danger lay in how it could be reported. William's account of the encounter was sent to Bismarck in Berlin. The message, drafted by Heinrich Abeken, described the king's meeting with Benedetti and the refusal to receive further demands. Bismarck read it in the company of Roon and Moltke. According to his later recollection, at a moment when he believed France might be brought into a war under conditions favorable to Prussia, the original telegram was longer and calmer than the version that would soon reach the public. It contained the material of a crisis, but not yet the hard edge that made the crisis ring across Europe. Bismarck edited the dispatch by shortening it. The altered version made the French demand appear more abrupt and the Prussian refusal more final. It did not invent the meeting, but it stripped away the softer diplomatic padding that might have left room for retreat. Printed in this form, the dispatch could be read in Paris as a slight to French honor and in Germany as evidence of French insolence toward the Prussian king. The same words pressed on two publics in opposite directions. That was the power of the edit. This miniature of the Ems dispatch shows Bismarck's method in one of its most concentrated forms. He did not command France to declare war. He did not need to. He shaped the conditions under which French pride, imperial weakness, newspaper pressure, and diplomatic irritation would do their own work. The dispatch became a document that seemed to disclose insult while actually arranging perception. It was politics conducted through punctuation, omission, and timing. France declared war on Prussia in July 1870. That decision gave Bismarck what he needed most. If Prussia had appeared to attack France in order to complete German unity, the southern states might have hesitated, and Europe might have judged Berlin more harshly. Because France declared war, Bismarck could present the conflict as defensive. The secret treaties with Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt came into effect. Southern German armies joined the northern German forces, and the national feeling that had remained incomplete after 1866 began to gather around a common enemy. The military balance favored Prussia and its German allies more than French confidence had allowed. Moltke's system of mobilization, railway coordination, staff planning, and army organization again proved its value. German forces moved with a coherence that reflected years of preparation, while the French army struggled with confusion in command and deployment. France possessed brave soldiers and modern weapons, including the chassepot rifle. But bravery and equipment could not compensate for weaknesses in organization. War revealed the administrative difference between the two states. Early German victories pushed the conflict into French territory. Battles at Wissembourg, Worth, and Spicheren showed that the war would not become the swift French assertion of prestige some in Paris had imagined. Marshal Bazaine's forces became tied down at Metz, while another French army under MacMahon moved under heavy pressure. Napoleon III, already physically unwell and politically strained, remained with the army as imperial authority and military necessity became entangled. The empire he had built on plebiscites, prestige, and memory of the first Napoleon now rested on an army unable to recover the initiative. Sedan became the decisive imperial catastrophe. On the 1st and 2nd of September 1870, French forces found themselves enclosed near the town, and the emperor himself was captured. The physical details of the fighting need not be dwelt upon to understand the scale of the result. An emperor who had declared war on Prussia now sat as a prisoner. His army had been defeated. The Second Empire collapsed almost immediately, and in Paris, a republic was proclaimed. Bismarck had not only won a military victory over France, he had helped bring down the regime that had chosen the war. Yet the fall of Napoleon III did not end the conflict. The new government of national defense in Paris continued resistance, unwilling to accept the terms Germany was likely to demand. This continuation complicated Bismarck's position. He had achieved the condition needed for German unity, because the southern states were fighting beside Prussia, but peace still required French concession. The siege of Paris began, and the war shifted from imperial contest to republican endurance. German armies stood before the French capital, while diplomats and politicians tried to determine what victory would cost. In Germany, the political meaning of the war deepened with each success. Southern rulers who had once guarded independence now found themselves drawn into negotiations over a wider German settlement. Bavaria, the strongest of the southern kingdoms, demanded privileges and assurances. Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt had their own concerns. Bismarck could not simply command them as conquered territories. He had to bargain, flatter, pressure, and arrange. Unity had to be made acceptable to rulers whose armies had joined the war, but whose sovereignty still had to be translated into imperial form. France's defeat created the emotional heat in which that translation became possible. German public opinion, already stirred by the sense of a defensive war, now looked toward national completion. The old liberal dream of unity had returned, but under Prussian military leadership and monarchical negotiation rather than parliamentary design. Men who had failed in 1848 could watch a different kind of Germany come into being through victories they had not directed. This was one of Bismarck's most striking inversions. He had taken national feeling away from the assemblies and placed it behind kings. The road from Ems to Sedan was therefore not only a road of war, it was a road through the last conditions that had kept German unification incomplete. France had been isolated. The southern states had been brought into common military action. Napoleon III had fallen. The North German Confederation now stood at the center of a wider German cause, and William I's position had grown from King of Prussia and federal president into something that could plausibly become imperial. What remained was form, title, consent, and symbolism. Those questions would be settled under circumstances that made French memory ache for generations. The German princes, the Prussian king, the soldiers of the victorious armies, and Bismarck himself would gather not in Berlin, not in Frankfurt, and not in some neutral German city, but at Versailles. There, in the Hall of Mirrors, The new empire would be proclaimed while Paris remained under siege, and German unity would receive an image inseparable from French humiliation. Chapter 10. The German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors. Versailles gave German unity a setting that no diplomat could pretend was neutral. The palace had been built as a monument to Bourbon monarchy and French grandeur, and its Hall of Mirrors carried the memory of a France that had once set the language of courtly power across Europe. In January 1871, that room received a different ceremony. German princes, officers, ministers, and representatives gathered there while Paris remained under siege, and the Kingdom of Prussia prepared to place its king at the head of a new empire. The choice of Versailles was not only practical. German headquarters were already there during the war, and the palace had become part of the military and diplomatic landscape of the campaign. Yet symbolism attached itself to the place whether Bismarck desired every layer of it or not. France had declared war to check Prussia's rise, and now the answer to that war would be spoken inside a French royal hall. For Germans, the scene offered completion after decades of frustration. For France, it became a memory of defeat made ceremonial. William I did not enter the imperial title with uncomplicated enthusiasm. He was King of Prussia, and that title carried the history, army, and divine right language he understood most naturally. Becoming German emperor raised questions of rank, sovereignty, and relation to the other German princes. He did not want to appear as though his old crown had been absorbed into a new national office created by negotiation. The title itself required care. The wording German Emperor was preferred over Emperor of Germany because the latter sounded too much like direct ownership of all German lands and rulers. Bismarck had to manage the pride of monarchs as carefully as the pressure of armies. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt had joined the war against France, but they did not enter the empire as conquered subjects. Bavaria in particular demanded reserved rights, including privileges in military administration, postal matters, and diplomacy. These concessions complicated unity, yet they also made it possible. Bismarck understood that a federation with uneven privileges could still serve Prussian leadership better than a demand for uniformity that delayed the settlement. Ludwig II of Bavaria became part of this arrangement in a manner that revealed the material underside of political symbolism. The Bavarian king, isolated in temperament and absorbed in his own royal imagination, was persuaded to send a letter inviting William I to assume the imperial dignity. Behind that letter stood pressure, negotiation, and financial inducement arranged through channels that later made the gesture look less spontaneous than ceremony required. The empire would be proclaimed as a gathering of princely consent. Consent, in 19th century politics, often had accounts attached to it. The constitution of the new German Empire largely extended the structure of the North German Confederation. This continuity mattered more than the ceremony. The Bundesrat remained the federal council of governments, the Reichstag remained elected by universal male suffrage, and the Chancellor remained responsible to the emperor rather than to parliament. Prussia held the presidency of the federation and dominated its military and diplomatic direction. The empire looked new, but much of its machinery had already been tested north of the Main. On the 18th of January 1871, the proclamation took place. The date carried Prussian memory, because on that day in 1701, Frederick I had crowned himself king in Prussia. Soldiers stood in the Hall of Mirrors, German rulers and princes gathered, and the language of empire was pronounced in the presence of men whose recent victories had made the ceremony possible. Bismarck wore a white cuirassier uniform, not merely civilian dress which suited the military origin of the moment. The empire arrived among uniforms, dynastic titles, and the formal gestures of princely agreement. The miniature of the Hall of Mirrors is often remembered as a single image, but the image contains tensions that can be missed when it is treated only as triumph. William of Prusse remained uneasy about the title. The Grand Duke of Baden led the cheers in a way that avoided some of the wording the king disliked. Bismarck, whose work had made the ceremony possible, stood within a scene that also irritated him through its courtly sensitivities and personal frictions. Unity had been achieved, but even at the moment of proclamation, it had to be handled carefully. The new empire was federal, monarchical, military, and national at once. Each word mattered. It was federal because the German state still existed and retained governments. It was monarchical because sovereignty moved through princes, not through a national constituent assembly. It was military because the wars of 1864, 1866, and 1870 had created the conditions Parliament had failed to create in 1848. It was national because millions of Germans now belonged to a common political structure whose public language claimed to embody German unity. Liberal nationalists had reason to feel both satisfaction and unease. Their old dream of unity had been realized, but not in the form many had once imagined. The empire had a parliament, but the government did not depend on parliamentary confidence. It had universal male suffrage, but executive authority remained tied to the crown. It had laws, elections, parties, and national debate, yet its commanding offices rested on monarchical and Prussian foundations. Bismarck had not destroyed liberal nationalism. He had taken much of its goal and placed it inside a conservative frame. The Franco-Prussian War still had to be concluded. Paris endured siege through the winter, and the new French government faced the harsh arithmetic of defeat. Jules Favre and other French representatives had to negotiate with Bismarck while the Republic struggled to preserve legitimacy at home. The armistice and later peace terms required France to accept a large indemnity and the loss of territory. Victory at Versailles therefore led directly into bargaining over money, borders, occupation, and national grief. Alsace and part of Lorraine became the most painful territorial question. Many German nationalists argued that these lands, with their German-speaking populations and historical ties to the old empire, belonged naturally within Germany. Strategic arguments also mattered, because military planners wanted a stronger frontier in the west. French feeling saw the annexation differently. To France, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine was not a technical adjustment of frontier security. It became a wound carried into public memory, school books, politics, and the emotional geography of the Republic. Bismarck himself had mixed concerns about annexation. He understood the strategic pressure for it and the strength of German opinion behind it, but he also understood that taking Alsace-Lorraine would make reconciliation with France much harder. Once the decision was made, the new empire gained territory and inherited a grievance. The provinces became an imperial land, governed directly rather than absorbed into Prussia or another member state. Their status reminded everyone that unity had been achieved not only by gathering Germans, but by ruling contested borderlands. The Treaty of Frankfurt in May 1871 set the formal terms. France owed an indemnity of 5 billion francs, and German troops would occupy parts of French territory until payment was complete. The sum was large, but France paid more quickly than many Germans expected, a sign of the country's financial resilience even after military defeat. German troops withdrew as the indemnity was settled. A peace had been signed, yet peace did not mean forgetfulness. In Paris, the trauma of war and siege was followed by the Paris Commune, a revolutionary municipal government that arose in the unsettled aftermath of defeat. The Commune was a French crisis rather than a German creation, but it formed part of the wider atmosphere in which the new German Empire entered Europe. Conservatives across the continent watched Paris with alarm. Bismarck, who had always feared revolutionary politics, could see in France's turmoil another confirmation of his belief that order required force, authority, and disciplined institutions. The new Germany would define itself partly against that revolutionary image. Inside the empire, the victory settlement gave Bismarck enormous prestige. Men who had once denounced him now had to reckon with the fact that he had brought about the unity others had failed to achieve. William Appice became emperor. Prussia became the leading power inside a federal Germany. The army gained a legend of effectiveness. National liberals entered the early imperial years with hopes that law, economic integration, and national institutions might gradually pull the empire toward constitutional maturity. Bismarck accepted their cooperation while keeping the chancellorship tied firmly to the monarch. The empire's birth, therefore, contained both consolidation and strain. It joined Germany, but under Prussian dominance. It satisfied national longing, but preserved dynastic privilege. It created a parliament, but denied parliament control over the ministry. It won a western frontier, but fixed French hostility more firmly than before. The proclamation in the Hall of Mirrors was a beginning dressed as a conclusion, and the years after 1871 would test whether Bismarck could govern the forces he had assembled. His task after Versailles was no longer to break the German Confederation, or isolate Austria, or draw the southern states into war. Those problems had been answered. The harder work now lay inside the empire itself, where Catholics, liberals, conservatives, workers, landowners, industrialists, soldiers, and socialists all had to be managed under one imperial roof. Bismarck had made Germany through conflict abroad and authority at home. He would next discover that a united country could contain opponents more stubborn than foreign ministries, because they lived inside the state he had created. Chapter 11. Catholics, Socialists, and the Limits of Command. The German Empire had been made by war, diplomacy, constitutional arrangement, and princely consent, but it could not be governed by those forces alone. Once the proclamation at Versailles had passed into memory, Bismarck faced a different kind of difficulty. Foreign enemies could be isolated, defeated, or bargained with across a table. Domestic opponents lived inside the empire's own laws, elections, churches, newspapers, unions, associations, and households. They could not be treated as temporary obstacles on the road to unity. They were part of the country unity had created. Bismarck entered the imperial years with immense authority, yet not with unlimited control. The constitution gave him a strong position as Chancellor, responsible to the emperor rather than to the Reichstag, and Prussia's dominance gave him great leverage inside the Bundesrat. Still, the elected chamber mattered, parties mattered, public opinion mattered. The empire had universal male suffrage for Reichstag elections, which meant that millions of men could express loyalties the Chancellor did not command. Bismarck had used modern political instruments to build Germany, and now those instruments began producing voices he did not welcome. Catholic political organization became his first great domestic struggle. The empire was led by Protestant Prussia, but it contained millions of Catholics, especially in the Rhineland, Westphalia, Bavaria, Silesia, and parts of the south and west. Their religious life was tied not only to local parishes and bishops, but to a worldwide church whose head, Pope Pius IX, had recently defined papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council. To Bismarck, this raised a question of loyalty. If Catholic obedience reached beyond the empire to Rome, he feared it might weaken the authority of the German state. This fear was sharpened by politics. Catholics had organized effectively in the Centre Party, and under leaders such as Ludwig Windthorst, they became one of the strongest parliamentary forces in the new empire. Windthorst was physically small, legally trained, sharp in debate, and difficult to intimidate. He had served in Hanover before Prussia annexed it, and he understood what Prussian power could do to smaller political worlds. In the Reichstag, he gave Catholic resistance a disciplined voice. Bismarck disliked him intensely, which is often a sign that he understood his importance. The Kulturkampf, the struggle over church and state, did not begin as a single law. It grew through measures that sought to bring Catholic institutions under state supervision. The Jesuits were expelled from the empire in 1872. The May Laws of 1873 placed clerical education and appointment under state control, required priests to receive approved training, and created mechanisms for disciplining clergy who resisted. Civil marriage became mandatory in Prussia and then across the empire. These measures were presented as defense of the modern state against clerical influence. The procedural texture of the Kulturkampf matters because it shows how Bismarck preferred to fight. He did not only denounce Catholic power in general terms, he used laws, examinations, administrative requirements, courts, police measures, and the removal of state payments. Bishops who refused compliance could be fined or imprisoned. Parishes could be left without recognized clergy. Seminaries could be closed or supervised. The conflict entered parish life through documents, appointments, school oversight, and the question of whether a priest could legally perform his office. Catholic resistance did not collapse under this pressure. Bishops, priests, Lay organizations and voters found ways to endure, protest, and strengthen their political identity. In some areas, state measures made Catholic life more conscious of itself as a community under attack. The Centre Party gained rather than disappeared. Windthorst and his allies could present themselves not as enemies of the empire, but as defenders of religious freedom and federal rights against Prussian dominance. A campaign meant to weaken Catholic political power helped make Catholic political loyalty more cohesive. This was one of the quiet lessons of Bismarck's domestic career. He knew how to defeat states. He found it harder to defeat communities. A state could sign a treaty, surrender a province, or accept exclusion from a confederation. A religious community could continue through habits, sacraments, family loyalties, schools, newspapers, and memory. The empire could regulate institutions, but it could not easily make Catholic voters stop seeing the Centre Party as their protection. Pope Pius IX and the Vatican also complicated the matter. Bismarck had hoped to distinguish between loyal German Catholics and clerical political obedience to Rome, but the practical effect of the struggle often narrowed that distinction. Catholics who might have accepted the empire in ordinary circumstances felt compelled to defend their church against state intrusion. The conflict therefore became less a clean contest between modern sovereignty and papal authority than a struggle over daily allegiance. A marriage register, a school appointment, or a bishop's letter could become a political fact. By the late 1870s, Bismarck began retreating from the harshest parts of the Kulturkampf. The death of Pius IX in 1878 and the election of Leo XIII opened room for accommodation. Bismarck also needed the Centre Party for other political purposes, especially as he turned against socialism and shifted economic policy. The laws were softened gradually, though not all anti-clerical measures vanished at once. His retreat was practical rather than apologetic. The Kulturkampf had not achieved what he wanted, and Bismarck did not usually cling to a failed instrument out of sentiment. Social democracy presented a different sort of opponent. Its roots lay not in confession, but in industrial society, wage labor, socialist theory, workers' associations, and the political organization of men who felt that the new empire served property and authority more readily than labor. August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht became leading figures in this movement, speaking for a socialism that combined parliamentary participation with criticism of the imperial order. Bismarck regarded them with suspicion and hostility. To him, socialism threatened not just a policy, but the social foundation on which monarchy and property rested. Industrial Germany was changing quickly. Coal, iron, railways, factories, urban growth, and the expansion of wage labor altered the human landscape of the empire. Workers gathered in districts where employment, housing, sickness, injury, and insecurity were shared conditions rather than private misfortunes. Socialist newspapers and meetings gave language to these experiences. The state could watch associations and restrict publications, but it could not unmake the conditions that made socialist politics meaningful. Machines, shifts, rent, wages, and accident risk were not abstractions inside working households. 2 assassination attempts against Emperor William I in 1878 gave Bismarck the opening to move harder against socialism. The men responsible were not agents of the Social Democratic Party in the direct way Bismarck implied, but the attempts created fear and anger that could be used politically. Bismarck dissolved the Reichstag after failing at first to secure the laws he wanted. New elections brought a more favorable chamber, and the anti-socialist laws were passed. Crisis once again became the moment in which he converted public alarm into authority. The anti-socialist laws banned socialist organizations, meetings, and publications. Though social democratic candidates could still stand for election as individuals, this detail mattered. Bismarck could suppress the party's organized public life, but the constitutional structure of the empire still left electoral space open. Socialist newspapers could be closed, associations dissolved, and activists expelled from certain cities under police powers. Yet voters could continue marking ballots for socialist candidates. Repression and representation existed beside each other in the same imperial system. Bebel and Liebknecht became figures of persistence under pressure. Their movement suffered arrests, surveillance, disruption, and exile from localities. But it did not disappear. In some respects, persecution gave socialism a stronger identity, much as the Kulturkampf had done for Catholic politics. Workers who saw their papers banned and their meetings restricted could interpret the state's hostility as proof of the movement's necessity. Bismarck could make organization difficult. He could not make the social question vanish. The limits of command appeared again. Bismarck had built a state with a strong executive, a disciplined army, and a constitution arranged to preserve monarchical authority. But the empire was also a mass political arena. Elections counted, parties learned, newspapers adapted, voters remembered. When Bismarck tried to crush Catholics, the Centre Party endured. When he tried to crush socialists, socialist voting strength eventually grew. His enemies could be weakened, divided, and harassed, but the empire itself kept giving them channels through which to return. His domestic struggles also altered his alliances. In the early empire, he worked with national liberals on legal and economic integration. During the Kulturkampf, many liberals supported his campaign against Catholic clerical influence, believing it served a modern secular state. Later, as Bismarck turned toward tariffs, conservative agricultural interests, and anti-socialist policy, the old liberal partnership weakened. He moved among parties as he had moved among foreign powers, seeking combinations that served the moment. Domestic politics became another field of shifting alignments. There was a difference, however, between manipulating parliaments and governing a society. Bismarck could threaten, bargain, dissolve, and pressure. He could use the Bundesrat, the emperor, and public fear, yet religious loyalty and class organization were not ministries that could be reshuffled. They had roots below the surface of formal power. In Catholic parishes and industrial districts, the empire was not merely a constitution written in 1871. It was experienced through schools, sermons, wages, police visits, ballots, and the cost of illness. By the early 1880s, Bismarck had learned that repression alone could not secure loyalty. This did not make him gentle, and it did not turn him into a democrat. It made him more inventive. If socialist organization could not be eliminated by law, perhaps workers could be drawn toward the state through protection. If industrial life created insecurity, perhaps the empire could offer insurance in the name of monarchy rather than revolution. The Chancellor, who had fought Catholics and socialists, would now help build a new kind of conservative state, one that entered the household not only through police and taxes, but through sickness funds, accident support, and the promise of old age security. Chapter 12. Insurance, tariffs, and the state that entered the household. Bismarck's answer to socialism was never only police pressure. The anti-socialist laws could close associations, restrict newspapers, and scatter organizers, but they could not remove the conditions that gave socialist politics its audience. Industrial workers still faced illness, injury, old age, unemployment, rent, and the ordinary uncertainty of wages. A party could be harassed. A household without income could not be argued out of fear. Bismarck understood enough of power to know that loyalty was not sustained by prohibition alone. The empire of the 1870s and 1880s was changing faster than the political language of monarchy could easily explain. Coalfields, ironworks, rail lines, machine shops, chemical plants, and expanding cities drew workers into new routines of labor. The village, the guild, and the older patronage of estate or town did not disappear everywhere at once, but industrial employment made risk more impersonal. A worker injured in a factory was not merely unlucky inside a familiar local world. He was part of an economy where machines, employers, insurance funds, inspectors, and state offices increasingly stood between suffering and survival. Bismarck did not approach this world as a social reformer in the later humanitarian sense. His purpose remained political. He wanted to weaken socialism, strengthen the empire, and bind working people to the state by making imperial authority useful in ordinary life. If workers associated protection only with socialist agitation, the state had already conceded too much ground. If the empire itself could provide sickness support, accident insurance, and old age assistance, then loyalty might be drawn away from revolutionary parties and toward monarchy. It was a conservative design using modern administrative tools. Economic policy had already shifted before the great insurance laws took shape. In 1879, Bismarck moved away from the freer trade policies associated with his earlier national liberal allies and supported protective tariffs on grain and industrial goods. This turn brought together landowners who feared cheap imported grain and industrialists who wanted shelter from foreign competition. The alliance of iron and rye, as later shorthand called it, gave Bismarck a new domestic base. It also marked the weakening of the early liberal partnership that had helped build the legal structure of the empire. Tariffs mattered beyond economics because they revealed how Bismarck now thought about political support. The national liberals had been useful during the first years after unification, when legal integration, commercial standardization, and national institutions required cooperation. Once socialism became the sharper enemy and agricultural conservatives demanded protection, Bismarck no longer wished to depend on liberal free trade assumptions. He preferred a coalition tied to state power, protection, monarchy, and social order. Revenue from tariffs also offered the imperial government a source of income less dependent on parliamentary bargaining. The social insurance program emerged from this same political landscape. Bismarck wanted legislation that would place the empire, not the socialist movement, in the position of provider. He spoke of the need to win the worker, or at least to detach him from those who promised a different society. Behind the calculation lay a larger change in the state's reach. Earlier governments had regulated poor relief, guilds, migration, and public order. But the new German measures entered wage labor more directly. They treated illness and injury as matters that could be organized through compulsory systems rather than left to charity, family, employer mercy, or local improvisation. The first major law was sickness insurance in 1883. It applied initially to many industrial workers and created funds supported by contributions from workers and employers. These funds provided medical treatment and cash payments for a limited period when illness prevented work. The law was not generous by modern standards, and it did not include everyone. Still, it altered the relationship between the working household and the state. A sick worker's claim could now move through a recognized fund, with rules, contributions, and administrative oversight. This miniature of sickness insurance is best understood through its procedures. A worker contributed a portion of wages, an employer contributed as well. Local funds, often connected to trades, workplaces, or municipalities, managed the benefits. Illness had to be certified, payments calculated, records kept, and disputes handled through offices rather than personal pleading alone. The system remained limited, uneven, and bureaucratic, but that bureaucracy was precisely the point. The empire was teaching its subjects that risk could be processed through institutions bearing the authority of law. Accident insurance followed in 1884, and it dealt with a different fear. Industrial accidents could end a worker's earning life in a moment, and ordinary sickness funds were not enough for long-term injury. The accident law placed much of the burden on employers, organized through associations that administered compensation. Bismarck preferred this arrangement because it reduced direct state financial responsibility while still making the system part of imperial social policy. Employers did not welcome every obligation, but they also gained a framework that could limit unpredictable liability. The factory accident had become one of the most visible moral problems of industrial society. A machine could take a hand from a skilled man. A fall, a boiler failure, or a mine injury could change a family's future before any savings had accumulated. Bismarck did not dwell on such suffering in sentimental language, but the legislation acknowledged that industrial labor created risks too large for individual workers to bear alone. Compensation became a matter of schedule, category, and entitlement. A life altered by injury entered a ledger as well as a household. Old age and disability insurance came in 1889, completing the main structure of Bismarck's social legislation. This law provided support for workers who reached the qualifying age or became permanently disabled. funded through contributions from workers, employers, and the state. The pension age was high enough that many laborers would never draw long benefits, and the payments were modest. Its symbolic meaning exceeded its immediate generosity. The empire had accepted in law that old age among workers could be a public concern. Bismarck's motives remained mixed and political. He did not believe in empowering workers as an independent class. He did not intend to make the Reichstag the master of social policy. He wanted the worker to see the emperor's state, rather than socialism, as the force that offered protection. In this sense, the social laws were another form of anti-socialist policy, but they operated through inclusion rather than exclusion. The same chancellor who banned socialist organizations helped create institutions that later generations would remember as foundations of the welfare state. The Reichstag did not simply receive these laws as imperial commands. Debate, amendment, resistance, and negotiation shaped the final forms. Conservatives, liberals, Catholics, and other factions had different views of cost, administration, and principle. The Centre Party, once Bismarck's great opponent in the Kulturkampf, often became important to the passage of social legislation. This was one reason his retreat from the harshest anti-Catholic policies mattered. A chancellor who needed votes could not fight every organized group at once. The National Liberals were less comfortable with some of Bismarck's later direction. Many had supported unification and legal integration, but tariffs, state intervention, and anti-socialist repression strained the relationship. Liberalism in the empire had to decide how much authority it would tolerate for the sake of nation and order. Some liberals feared that social insurance would expand bureaucracy and weaken individual responsibility. Others accepted parts of the program as necessary adaptation. Bismarck used these divisions as he used divisions among foreign powers. Administration gave the laws their staying power. Insurance was not a speech, a symbol, or a festival of national unity. It required forms, contribution records, employer compliance, medical certification, local boards, and mechanisms for appeal. Officials had to know who was covered, what was owed, and when payment began. The state's presence could be felt in a worker's pay deduction and in a sickness fund's decision. Politics entered the household not as an abstract doctrine, but as a document that might determine whether money arrived during weeks without wages. This new presence did not make workers loyal in the way Bismarck hoped. Social democratic support continued to grow despite the anti-socialist laws and despite the insurance measures. Workers could accept benefits from the state while still voting for the party the state tried to suppress. That fact frustrated the chancellor's expectation that gratitude could be politically directed. A benefit could reduce insecurity without producing obedience. The household could take the money and keep its opinions. Even so, the legislation changed the empire. It gave Germany one of the earliest and most influential systems of social insurance in the industrial world. It also showed that a conservative government could respond to modern social pressure without surrendering its claim to authority. Bismarck's state did not become democratic in spirit because it insured workers. It became more intrusive, more capable, and more difficult to describe in older categories. A monarchy that had been defended through army reform now reached into sickness, accident, and old age. The contrast with the earlier unification wars is striking. In the 1860s, Bismarck had used conflicts with Denmark, Austria, and France to change the map. In the 1880s, he used insurance laws and tariffs to change the relationship between government and society. The methods were different, but the underlying habit remained recognizable. He identified pressure, refused to meet it on his opponent's terms, and built an instrument that served his own design. German unity had been made with armies and treaties. Imperial stability, he hoped, would be made with police laws, tariff walls, and benefit funds. Yet social policy could not solve the larger problem of governing a modern empire. Catholics had not been broken by the Kulturkampf. Socialists had not disappeared under repression. Liberals had not become permanently reliable. Conservatives wanted protection, but not always the costs of administration. Industrialists accepted order but resisted burdens when they touched profit. Workers received insurance but did not necessarily give their loyalty in return. The empire was growing more complex than any single chancellor could command by will alone. Bismarck's domestic statecraft therefore carried both achievement and warning. The insurance laws outlived the immediate anti-socialist strategy that helped produce them. The tariffs reshaped political alliances. The state grew stronger, but society did not become simpler. Each measure designed to contain conflict also acknowledged that conflict had become permanent. A Germany made through unification now had to live with the daily politics of class, confession, industry, and representation. While these domestic struggles unfolded, Bismarck also watched Europe with increasing care. The empire he had created sat in the center of the continent, too strong to be ignored and too new to be trusted fully. France remembered Alsace-Lorraine. Austria-Hungary had accepted exclusion from Germany but still mattered in the east. Russia watched the Balkans and its own influence with suspicion. Britain looked toward balance and empire beyond Europe. Bismarck's next task was to keep this restless continent arranged in such a way that Germany's strength did not become the reason all others combined against it. Chapter 13. Alliances around a restless continent. Europe after 1871 had to adjust to a fact that many statesmen had long tried to avoid. A powerful Germany now stood in the center of the continent, with a victorious army, a large population, growing industry, and a leadership that had already shown how quickly the balance could change. Bismarck understood the danger of this position better than some of the nationalists who celebrated it. Before unification, Prussia had been one ambitious power among others. After unification, Germany became the state around which others measured their fears. France was the first and most obvious problem. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine made reconciliation difficult, and Bismarck did not expect French memory to fade quickly. A defeated country could recover strength, form alliances, and wait. He therefore wanted France isolated, not constantly provoked. The new empire could not afford a coalition in which France found partners to the east or south. German security, in Bismarck's mind, depended less on another triumphant war than on preventing the diplomatic conditions that would make such a war dangerous. Austria-Hungary occupied a different place in this system. The defeat of 1866 had removed Austria from German affairs, but it had not removed the Habsburg monarchy from Europe. After the Compromise of 1867 created Austria-Hungary, the empire remained a major power with interests in the Balkans and anxieties about Russia. Bismarck had spared Austria from harsher treatment after Königgrätz, partly because he knew Germany might one day need Vienna as a partner. In the 1870s, that calculation became increasingly important. Russia was both old friend and future complication. Prussia and Russia had long-standing dynastic and conservative ties, and Russian goodwill had helped Prussia during earlier crises. Yet Russia's ambitions in the Balkans and its rivalry with Austria-Hungary created a problem Bismarck could not solve permanently. If Germany leaned too far toward Vienna, Russia might drift toward France. If Germany leaned too far toward Russia, Austria-Hungary might feel abandoned. The empire Bismarck had made now required a diplomacy of constant adjustment. The League of the Three Emperors, formed in the 1870s, reflected his attempt to bind Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia into a conservative understanding. The three monarchies shared fear of revolution and an interest in maintaining order, but shared fear could not erase competing ambitions. The Balkans remained the region where the arrangement was most fragile. National movements, Ottoman weakness, Russian influence, Austrian suspicion, and local claims all overlapped in ways that no treaty could make simple. Bismarck wanted the Eastern Question managed without allowing it to become a Western catastrophe. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 placed these tensions in sharper form. Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire and imposed the Treaty of San Stefano, which promised a large Bulgaria under heavy Russian influence. Austria-Hungary feared that this would make the Balkans a corridor of Russian power. Britain, under Benjamin Disraeli, also opposed a settlement that seemed to alter the Eastern Mediterranean balance too strongly in Russia's favor. The crisis did not directly concern Germany's borders, but Bismarck knew that Germany could be drawn into danger if Austria and Russia became irreconcilable enemies. Berlin became the meeting place for revision. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Bismarck presented himself as an honest broker, a phrase that captured his preferred public posture even if every power understood that Germany had interests of its own. Representatives of the great powers gathered to reconsider the San Stefano settlement. Russia came with victory already won but diplomatically contested. Austria-Hungary came seeking security and influence. Britain came determined to limit Russian gains. The Ottoman Empire came weakened, bargaining over what remained. The table at Berlin was not a battlefield, but it carried the weight of one. Bismarck presided with the authority of a statesman whose empire had no direct territorial claim in the Balkans, which allowed him to appear more detached than the others. The settlement reduced the size of Bulgaria, recognized or adjusted the position of several Balkan states, and allowed Austria-Hungary to occupy and administer Bosnia and Herzegovina while they formally remained under Ottoman sovereignty. Each provision tried to satisfy one anxiety without satisfying it completely. That was often the nature of European diplomacy. Enough concession to avoid immediate war, not enough justice to end grievance. Russia left the Congress resentful. Many Russians felt that their military sacrifices had been discounted by diplomats and that Germany had not supported them as an old partner should have done. Bismarck understood the resentment, but he also knew that allowing Russia everything it wanted would have driven Austria-Hungary into deeper insecurity. Germany's position required him to disappoint someone. The difficulty was to disappoint Russia without losing it entirely, and to support Austria-Hungary without becoming captive to every Habsburg fear. In 1879, Bismarck moved toward the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. This treaty committed Germany and Austria-Hungary to support each other if Russia attacked either of them, and to benevolent neutrality if another power attacked. The alliance gave Germany a firm partner and reassured Vienna, but it also marked a more defined alignment than Bismarck had once preferred. He did not want a simple anti-Russian bloc. He wanted Russia to understand the limits of pressure while still leaving room for connection. A treaty could steady one relationship and disturb another. The Triple Alliance followed in 1882, adding Italy to the German and Austro-Hungarian connection. Italy had its own grievances and ambitions, including tensions with France in North Africa and unresolved strains with Austria-Hungary over Italian-speaking territories. Its entry into the alliance system helped Bismarck keep France diplomatically constrained, yet Italy was not a partner of the same weight as Austria-Hungary, and its interests did not always fit neatly with those of Vienna. The alliance widened Germany's diplomatic network without removing the need for care. Bismarck's alliance system was therefore less a fixed machine than a set of overlapping restraints. He wanted France without friends, Austria-Hungary reassured, Russia unalienated, Britain unthreatened, and Germany free from unnecessary colonial or Balkan adventures. This required an unusual discipline after victory. Many new empires seek more symbols, more territory, and more visible demonstrations of strength. Bismarck's mature foreign policy often sought the opposite. Germany had gained enough to alarm Europe. It now needed to make its power appear satisfied. Britain watched the continent from a position shaped by naval strength, imperial commitments, and suspicion of any single power dominating Europe. Bismarck did not want Britain as an enemy. He avoided building a navy that would challenge British command of the seas, and for much of his chancellorship he treated overseas colonies as distractions from Germany's Central European security. Later, under domestic and commercial pressure, Germany did acquire colonies in Africa and the Pacific during the 1880s. But Bismarck never placed colonial expansion at the heart of his strategy. Europe remained the board on which danger mattered most. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 showed the complexity of his late diplomacy. Germany and Russia agreed to neutrality if either became involved in war with a third great power, with important exceptions if Germany attacked France or Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. The treaty was secret, delicate, and difficult to reconcile with the public meaning of the dual alliance. Its purpose was to keep Russia from drifting toward France while preserving Germany's Austrian connection. Bismarck believed he could hold these tensions through personal management, secrecy, and precise limitation. Such diplomacy depended heavily on him. That was both its strength and its weakness. He knew the histories, fears, vanities, and limits of the courts involved. He could write, receive, delay, reassure, and warn with a sense of how one move would be read in several capitals at once. Yet a system so dependent on one statesman's judgment could become fragile once his authority weakened. Treaties might remain on paper, but the habits of interpretation surrounding them were harder to inherit. There was also a moral narrowness in the system, though Bismarck would not have described it that way. The Balkans appeared mostly as a zone of great power management, not as a collection of peoples whose aspirations deserved equal attention. France appeared as a problem to be isolated, not as a country whose grief over lost provinces could be reconciled. Smaller states appeared according to the pressure they exerted on larger arrangements. This was not unusual for 19th century diplomacy. It was precisely why great power peace often left smaller grievances alive beneath it. For Germany, however, the results were real. Between 1871 and Bismarck's dismissal in 1890, the empire avoided another major European war. France remained isolated for much of the period. Austria-Hungary became Germany's chief ally. Russia was not always friendly, but Bismarck worked to keep the break from becoming final. The continent remained tense, but tension did not automatically become general war. The man who had used conflict to make Germany now spent much of his later authority preventing Germany's strength from summoning a coalition against it. This late role complicates the simple image of Bismarck as only a war maker. He had never been a pacifist, and he had not hesitated to use war when it served a political purpose. After 1871, he judged that Germany's main purpose was preservation. A further war of expansion could threaten everything already gained. His task became the management of fear: French fear, Austrian fear, Russian fear, British suspicion, and the smaller fears of states that lived between larger ambitions. In that sense, his diplomacy after unification was a long attempt to convince Europe that the new empire was formidable but not restless. Yet age, illness, irritation, and political habit made this work harder as the years passed. Bismarck remained powerful, but the world around him was changing. William IV, the old emperor who had trusted him through war and empire building, was nearing the end of his life. Parties inside Germany continued to grow more difficult. Social Democrats still gained votes. The young generation at court did not always want to live under the shadow of the old Chancellor. The alliance system needed careful hands, but the hands that held it were becoming more isolated. Germany's position at the center of Europe had been secured, but not made simple. The empire needed restraint abroad and discipline at home, and Bismarck had supplied both through force of will, institutional skill, and an unusual capacity for controlled contradiction. Still, no arrangement built around one man could remain forever his possession. The treaties, parties, ministries, and royal relationships he had managed so fiercely would soon pass into a different atmosphere, where a young emperor wanted command in his own name and the old chancellor found that the palace no longer belonged to him in quite the same way. Chapter 14. The Young Emperor and the Old Chancellor. William I's death in March 1888 removed more than an emperor from the German Empire. It removed the relationship on which Bismarck's authority had rested for a generation. The old king had not always agreed with his minister. He had argued with him, resisted him, threatened resignation in reverse by forcing Bismarck to threaten his own, and often found the chancellor's methods too hard for his sense of royal dignity. Yet the bond had endured through the army conflict, the war with Denmark, the defeat of Austria, the struggle with France, the proclamation at Versailles, and the long work of imperial government. Between them lay memory, habit, and the knowledge that each man had made the other's reign possible. The succession did not pass immediately into the hands of Wilhelm II. Frederick III, William IV's son, became emperor first, but his reign lasted only 99 days. He was already gravely ill with throat cancer when he came to the throne, and the hopes attached to him therefore lived more in expectation than in policy. Liberals had long imagined that Frederick, with his English connections and different temperament, might soften the empire's political structure or reduce Bismarck's dominance. The illness made such possibilities fragile before they could take institutional form. Germany passed through one emperor almost as though through a doorway that did not fully open. Wilhelm II came to power in June 1888, young, restless, theatrical in temperament, and eager to rule in his own name. He had grown up inside the empire Bismarck made, not inside the older Prussia that had felt defeat under Napoleon or humiliation at Olmütz. For William I, Bismarck had been the indispensable servant who saved the army reform and gave the monarchy a German empire. For Wilhelm II, Bismarck was a giant inheritance standing between the new emperor and the full exercise of imperial personality. The difference in age mattered, but the difference in historical memory mattered even more. The young emperor did not lack intelligence or energy. He lacked the patience for being managed. He wanted ministers to know that authority flowed from the crown, not from the old chancellor's office. He wanted public gestures, personal contact with workers, visible monarchy, and a style of rule more direct than Bismarck's guarded system of cabinet control and parliamentary manipulation. The empire had been built by a man who preferred to arrange pressures before appearing to decide. Wilhelm preferred the appearance of decision itself. Bismarck had spent decades making himself the hinge of government. Ministers were expected to pass through him. Policy lines crossed his desk. The emperor's authority was real, but under William I, it had often moved through the chancellor's interpretation. Bismarck's control of access, timing, documents, and resignation threats had made the office of chancellor larger than the constitution alone described. He had not created a collective cabinet government in the British sense. He had created an imperial administration in which other ministers were subordinate figures beside one enormous political will. That system required an emperor willing to tolerate it. Wilhelm II was not willing for long. The conflict first gathered around social policy and the handling of labor unrest. Bismarck wanted to continue the anti-socialist laws and, if necessary, sharpen the confrontation with social democracy. The emperor wished to appear as a ruler concerned for workers, not only as a guardian against socialism. He did not intend to become socialist, nor did he reject monarchy's authority. He wanted a monarchical social policy that bore his own stamp, rather than Bismarck's older mixture of repression and calculation. Labor unrest in the late 1880s made this disagreement practical. Strikes and working-class organization forced the imperial government to decide how it would speak to industrial society. Bismarck saw danger, party organization, and the need for pressure. Wilhelm saw danger too, but also opportunity for royal paternalism, public sympathy, and a new imperial tone. The Chancellor had already built sickness insurance, accident insurance, and old age insurance, yet he remained committed to limiting socialist politics. The Emperor wished to show that the Crown could stand above class conflict as a benevolent force. Behind the policy dispute stood a deeper question of command. Bismarck wanted ministers to consult him before approaching the Emperor. An old Prussian cabinet order from 1852 had supported this practice by requiring ministers to report through the minister-president. Wilhelm resented it because it made the Chancellor the gatekeeper of the monarch's own government. To a young ruler determined to reign actively, such a rule felt like a chain placed around the throne by the servant who claimed to defend it. The argument over procedure therefore carried the whole future of authority inside it. The Reichstag elections of 1890 weakened Bismarck's position further. The parties he disliked, especially the Social Democrats and the Centre, showed strength. The anti-socialist laws were not renewed. Bismarck considered new political maneuvers, including the possibility of governing through sharper conflict, but the old combinations no longer worked with the same certainty. His methods had depended on dividing enemies, shifting allies, and using fear at the right moment. Germany had become harder to divide on command. The miniature of Bismarck's dismissal belongs not to a battlefield or a treaty table, but to offices, audiences, memoranda, and strained conversations. Wilhelm II and Bismarck did not merely disagree over one law. They disagreed over who would possess the living authority of the empire. Bismarck could threaten resignation because for decades that threat had forced hesitation in others. Under William I, it had often brought the monarch back toward him. With Wilhelm II, the threat moved differently. A resignation offered to pressure the crown could be accepted. In March 1890, Bismarck was forced from office. The formal language of resignation and dismissal softened the rupture, but it did not hide its meaning. The man who had governed Prussia since 1862 and the German Empire since 1871 no longer controlled the state he had shaped. He received the title Duke of Lauenburg, though he disliked the substitution of honor for power and used the title rarely. Titles could decorate retirement, they could not replace command. Caprivi succeeded him as Chancellor, a capable soldier and administrator, but not another Bismarck. That was partly the point. Wilhelm II did not want another minister whose shadow could cover the throne. The new reign would seek a different manner of government, less dependent on the old Chancellor's secretive balancing and more exposed to the Emperor's impulses, court influences, public gestures, and the changing pressures of European politics. Germany did not transform in one day. Still, the removal of Bismarck changed the way decisions would be made. The dismissal also altered the meaning of Bismarck's past. While he held office, his earlier actions were part of an active system. After 1890, they became memory, argument, and weapon. Supporters could look back to him as the founder who had understood Europe better than his successors. Critics could point to the authoritarian habits, the repression, the conflicts with Catholics and socialists, and the constitution that left too much power above Parliament. Bismarck himself would not remain silent enough for others to possess the story without him. The old Chancellor left Berlin for Friedrichsruhe, but he did not leave public life in the inward sense. Retirement gave him distance without giving him peace. He still had allies, visitors, journalists, family members, papers, recollections, and grievances. The empire continued without his hand on the machinery, and that continuation was itself a wound to a man who had made indispensability part of his method. He had spent decades teaching Germany that power required his judgment. Now Germany would test whether it could move without him. His fall revealed the central weakness of personal statecraft. Bismarck had built institutions, but he had also bent them around himself. He had created alliances, but much of their management depended on his caution. He had governed parties, but often through conflict rather than durable reconciliation. He had served monarchy, but his own authority had grown so large that a young monarch could experience him as a rival. The dismissal did not erase his achievements. It exposed how much of the imperial order had rested on habit, personality, and an old emperor's trust. Germany after Bismarck was not yet the Germany of catastrophe that later memory would search for in every decision. It was a confident empire, industrially powerful, militarily respected, socially restless, and diplomatically watched. Yet something had changed in the atmosphere of rule. The old Chancellor had been removed from the palace, and the young emperor had claimed the space around the throne for himself. The next part of Bismarck's story belongs outside office, where the founder of the empire became its most famous critic, sitting among papers and trees at Friedrichsruhe while the country he had made learned to live with his absence. Chapter 15. Friedrichsruhe and the man who would not disappear. Friedrichsruhe gave Bismarck distance from Berlin, but it did not give him silence. The estate lay in the Sachsenwald, east of Hamburg, among woods and paths far removed from the daily traffic of ministries, audiences, dispatches, and parliamentary conflict. It had been granted to him after the wars of unification, a material reward from the monarchy he had served and strengthened. In retirement, it became something else. It became the place where a dismissed chancellor could turn memory into argument. The change from Berlin to Friedrichsruhe was more than a change of residence. In office, Bismarck had lived at the crossing point of reports, royal decisions, party maneuvers, and European diplomacy. Papers came because power required them to come. Visitors waited because his approval mattered. Ministers adjusted themselves to his temper and timing. At Friedrichsruhe, the movement reversed. Those who came did so to consult, flatter, listen, remember, or gather the words of a man who no longer ruled but still seemed too large to become private. Bismarck did not accept obscurity with grace. His whole political life had trained him to treat influence as something that had to be exercised, guarded, and recovered when threatened. Retirement could not easily become rest for a man who believed that his successors misunderstood both Germany and Europe. Wilhelm II's government continued without him, but he followed it with the irritated attention of someone who saw every departure from his method as proof of decline. A younger man might have called this ambition. In old age, it became a mixture of wounded authority, memory, and genuine alarm. The estate itself helped shape his late public image. Friedrichsruhe was not a salon in the center of a capital. It allowed Bismarck to appear as the old founder among trees, papers, dogs, family members, and selected guests. The setting suited the legend of a man who had come from the landed Prussian world and returned to it after remaking Europe. Visitors could encounter him not as a minister behind a government desk, but as a retired patriarch whose words seemed to come from a deeper store of experience. The distance from power made his speech feel freer, though not always wiser. Journalists understood the value of that voice. Bismarck's remarks, complaints, judgments, and recollections traveled beyond Friedrichsruhe through newspapers and conversations. He could not command policy, but he could disturb reputations. The press gave him a second instrument after office, and he used it with the same awareness of timing that had marked his earlier career. A comment from Friedrichsruhe could remind Germany that the founder still watched. It could also remind Wilhelm II that dismissal had not made Bismarck harmless. His son Herbert remained part of this late world. Herbert von Bismarck had served in the Foreign Office and had been deeply tied to his father's political household. When Bismarck fell, Herbert resigned as well, a gesture of loyalty that also narrowed the family's formal place in government. The relationship between father and son had always carried the weight of expectation. Bismarck's public life drew his family into its orbit, and retirement did not fully release them. Friedrichsruhe held not only an old statesman's papers, but the residue of a family arranged around power. Johanna's presence, until her death in 1894, gave the estate another kind of continuity. She had known Bismarck before the ministries, before the wars, before Versailles, before the title of Chancellor had become inseparable from his name. Their marriage had endured long absences, illnesses, tensions, and the consuming pressure of public life. In his letters to her, Bismarck had often revealed dependence beneath command. At Friedrichsruhe, the private foundation of his life remained visible in a way that Berlin had often concealed. Bismarck's health had troubled him for much of his career, and in old age the body became harder to ignore. He had long suffered from neuralgia, digestive troubles, sleeplessness, and weight that fluctuated with stress and treatment. His doctors, diets, baths, and complaints formed a domestic counterpoint to the image of iron will. The body that had carried decades of anger, labor, tobacco, food, and pressure did not become symbolic because admirers called him iron. It remained physical, troublesome, and present. Yet illness did not soften his appetite for political judgment. He watched Caprivi's policies with suspicion, especially the decision not to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia in 1890. To Bismarck, this was one of the most dangerous departures from his system. He had worked to keep Russia from falling into France's arms while maintaining the Austrian alliance. His successors found the secret arrangement difficult to reconcile with other commitments and allowed it to lapse. In the years that followed, France and Russia moved closer, forming the alliance Bismarck had long tried to prevent. From Friedrichsruhe, this development could appear as vindication. Bismarck believed that Germany had exchanged careful balancing for unnecessary exposure. He may not have understood every new pressure of the post-1890 world, and his own system had always depended on tensions difficult to sustain. Still, his warning carried weight because it touched a real change. The diplomatic web he had maintained did not survive intact without him. The empire remained strong, but strength with fewer cushions around it was not the same condition he had tried to preserve. Wilhelm II's public style also troubled him. The emperor wanted Germany to be seen, heard, and respected in a more personal and expansive way. He spoke often, traveled, staged monarchy, and later encouraged policies that gave Germany a more assertive world presence. Bismarck had not been shy, and he had not lacked ambition, but his mature foreign policy after 1871 had been cautious about unnecessary display. He had preferred a satisfied Germany, or at least the appearance of one. The young emperor's manner suggested movement, appetite, and impatience. The old Chancellor's criticisms were not always cleanly separated from personal bitterness. He had been dismissed, and dismissed men often discover principles inside their injuries. Yet Bismarck was not merely sulking at Friedrichsruh. He had a coherent fear that Germany's position in Europe required restraint and that the new leadership did not fully understand the cost of alarming others. His pride sharpened that fear, and his memory armed it. He knew too much about how fear worked in foreign capitals to treat theatrical power as harmless. His memoirs became the great written instrument of this late period, Gedanken und Erinnerungen, usually translated as thoughts and memories, allowed him to present his life and policy in his own arrangement. Memoirs are never neutral documents, and Bismarck's were no exception. They defended, explained, omitted, justified, and shaped the reader's sense of inevitability. He wrote as a man who had made decisions under pressure, and then wished to control how those decisions would be understood after the pressure had passed. The act of remembering suited him because his career had always depended on interpretation. Schleswig-Holstein had to be interpreted in one way, Ems in another, the budget conflict through a legal gap, the Kulturkampf through state sovereignty, social insurance through loyalty, alliances through necessity. In memoir, the same habit turned backward. He arranged his own past as he had once arranged crises, placing emphasis where it helped his case and reducing what complicated it. The old Chancellor no longer edited telegrams for immediate effect. He edited memory for history. Germany received him in retirement with a mixture of reverence, curiosity, and partisan use. Conservatives could honor him as the founder who had preserved monarchy while creating empire. Nationalists could celebrate him as the man who had humbled Austria and France. Liberals could not forget his contempt for parliamentary responsibility, even if many had cooperated with him after 1866. Catholics remembered the Kulturkampf. Social Democrats remembered repression and police power. No single Germany owned Bismarck's image, because no single Germany had experienced his rule in the same way. Public celebrations around his birthdays revealed how large that image had become. Monuments, speeches, student honors, veterans' memories, and patriotic writing turned Bismarck into a living national symbol while he was still alive to contradict the uses made of him. There was an oddness in this. The man who distrusted much popular politics became an object of mass commemoration. A statesman who had manipulated national feeling now found national feeling wrapping itself around him. He accepted admiration, but he did not disappear into it. Friedrichsruh therefore became a place of double life. It was private estate and public shrine, household and political outpost, retreat and listening post. The trees around it gave the appearance of withdrawal, but the papers inside carried argument. Visitors arrived to see the founder. Journalists arrived to carry away judgment. Family members lived beside a man whose moods could still fill rooms even when he no longer filled ministries. The empire continued in Berlin, but one part of its memory had settled in the Sachsenwald. As the 1890s moved on, Bismarck's place in German life became less that of an alternative ruler and more that of a measuring rod. Policies could be called Bismarckian or un-Bismarckian. Restraint could be praised in his name, or new ambition justified against his supposed limitations. His actual complexity began to harden into legend. Legends are useful because they simplify what people need from the dead and the nearly dead. Bismarck was still alive, but the legend had already begun its work. The man himself remained more difficult than the statue. He could be tender and cruel, far-sighted and vindictive, disciplined in policy and unruly in emotion. Conservative in loyalty and revolutionary in method. He had made a nation without trusting many of the forces that nations release. He had defended monarchy by building structures that brought millions of voters into imperial politics. He had contained Europe for nearly 2 decades after helping overturn it. Retirement did not resolve these contradictions. It merely placed them under the roof of an old man who still believed he understood Germany better than those who governed it. By the late 1890s, time was doing what Wilhelm II had done politically. It was removing Bismarck from command, then from argument, and soon from life itself. Friedrichsruh remained, with its rooms, papers, visitors, and wooded paths. but the body at the center of it weakened. The empire he had made was moving into a new century with new ambitions, new industries, new parties, and new dangers. Before that future fully arrived, Germany would pause over the death of the man who had given it form, and the last chapter of his life would become the first chapter of his afterlife. Chapter 16. The Empire after the founder Bismarck died on the 30th of July 1898 at Friedrichsruh, far from the rooms where he had once controlled the movement of ministers, monarchs, ambassadors, and parties. His death did not surprise Germany in the way a sudden catastrophe might have done. He was old, ill, and already partly transformed into memory while still alive. Yet the passing of the founder gave the empire a moment in which to look back across its own short history. The man who had entered power in Prussia during a budget crisis had left behind a German empire, an altered European order, and a political inheritance no successor could carry in exactly the same way. The funeral and mourning around Bismarck belonged to a country that had learned to treat him as more than a former chancellor. He had become a national symbol, though the nation did not agree on what the symbol meant. For many conservatives, he stood for monarchy, discipline, military strength, and the preservation of order against liberal and socialist pressure. For nationalists, he was the maker of unity, the man who had turned German longing into a state. For Catholics, his memory still carried the wounds of the Kulturkampf. For Social Democrats, he remained the author of repression as well as the maker of social insurance. His death gathered these meanings without reconciling them. Friedrichsruh itself became part of the memory. The estate where he had spent retirement now held the stillness of papers no longer being used for argument, rooms no longer arranged around visitors seeking judgment, and wooded paths no longer crossed by a man whose presence had made even withdrawal political. Burial did not remove him from public life. It gave public life a fixed place to visit. A grave can become another kind of office when the person buried there has shaped the state that surrounds it. The empire continued under Wilhelm II, and this continuation mattered. Bismarck had often acted as though Germany's safety depended on his own judgment, but no state can stop moving because its founder dies. Ministries still opened their files. The Reichstag still met. Parties still contested elections. The army still trained. Factories still worked. Insurance offices still processed claims. Railways still carried goods, soldiers, letters, and passengers across a country that had not existed as one country when Bismarck was born. The machinery he helped assemble did not fall silent with him, yet the machinery did not move in the same atmosphere. Wilhelm II's Germany wanted recognition in a more visible and expansive way. The emperor's reign placed greater emphasis on world policy, naval development, colonial ambition, and the public display of imperial energy. Bismarck had not opposed every colonial step, but he had treated overseas empire as secondary to the balance of Europe. The new generation thought more readily in terms of global status. A state that Bismarck had tried to present as satisfied began to look, to some observers abroad, less settled than its founder had wished. The alliance system also changed after him. The reinsurance treaty with Russia had already lapsed in 1890, and France and Russia moved toward alliance in the years that followed. This was the development Bismarck had feared most clearly from Friedrichsruh. His whole diplomatic system after 1871 had sought to prevent France from finding a great power partner. Once Russia and France came together, Germany faced the possibility of pressure from both East and West. The danger was not immediate destruction. It was the narrowing of diplomatic room. No single decision after Bismarck explains the later course of Europe, and it would be too easy to treat his dismissal as the first scene of an inevitable tragedy. History rarely moves with that kind of neatness. The Germany of the 1900s was shaped by industry, population growth, military planning, imperial competition, nationalism, social conflict, court politics, and the choices of many governments beyond Berlin. Still, Bismarck's absence left a visible gap. His successors inherited his empire, but not his authority over its contradictions. Some of those contradictions were built into the constitution itself. The Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, yet the Chancellor did not depend on its confidence. The Emperor and Bundesrat held commanding authority, while political parties grew larger and more organized in public life. Social Democrats gained votes despite the old repression. The Centre Party remained strong. Liberals divided and recombined. Conservatives defended monarchy and property while depending on mass politics more than they liked to admit. Bismarck had designed a state that could use modern participation without becoming parliamentary in the full sense, and that tension did not disappear. His social legislation also outlived its original purpose. Sickness insurance, accident insurance, and old age support had been meant in part to weaken socialism by binding workers to the imperial state. Socialism was not weakened in the way he hoped, yet the insurance system endured because it answered needs that industrial society could not ignore. Workers might vote against the government and still claim benefits from laws the government had made. This was one of the ironies of Bismarck's career. Policies designed for control often created structures that later generations used for purposes beyond his own. The Kulturkampf left another inheritance. Bismarck had tried to subordinate Catholic institutions more tightly to the state, but the campaign strengthened Catholic political identity and confirmed the Centre Party as a durable force. His retreat from the struggle showed his practicality, but the memory remained. German unity had not dissolved confessional difference. It had gathered that difference into an imperial system where Catholics could vote, organize, negotiate, and remember. The empire was national, but it was not culturally simple. The wars of unification left the most visible inheritance. Denmark had been defeated over Schleswig and Holstein. Austria had been excluded from Germany. France had lost Alsace-Lorraine. Each victory solved a problem and created a residue. Schleswig-Holstein became part of the new order. Austria-Hungary became ally rather than German rival. France became the lasting dissatisfied power in the West. Bismarck understood these residues better than most celebrants of victory. That was why, after 1871, he worked so hard to prevent the empire's strength from becoming a reason for encirclement. His personal legacy became difficult to separate from the mythology built around him. The phrase Iron Chancellor hardened him into an image of will, force, and command. Monuments made him taller and simpler. Schoolbooks and patriotic speeches reduced his contradictions into lessons useful for the moment. Yet the historical Bismarck was not only hard, he was nervous, often ill, emotionally dependent in private, vindictive toward enemies, brilliant in crisis, capable of restraint, and willing to abandon ideological friends when state interest required it. He was less a statue of iron than a man of pressure. That pressure was visible in the way he handled time. He could wait through a constitutional deadlock, carry a dispute forward until an opponent made the useful move, and leave a settlement unfinished because an unfinished settlement might contain the next advantage. Schleswig-Holstein after Denmark, Austria after Königgrätz, the southern states after 1866, and the alliance system after 1871 all showed this patience. He did not always resolve history. He arranged it so that the next turn was more likely to favor Prussia or Germany. There were costs to such statecraft. Bismarck's politics often deepened the habit of governing through conflict. He used enemies to form majorities, crises to discipline opinion, and fear to move institutions. Liberals, Catholics, socialists, and foreign governments all learned that he could be a master of pressure. That mastery produced achievements of enormous scale, but it did not teach Germany how to reconcile its own political society. The empire he left was strong, but not settled in its inner life. His achievement remains immense because German unification was not inevitable in the form it took. The map after 1815 could have endured longer. Austria might have remained the senior German power. Liberal nationalism might have failed without conservative appropriation. Prussia might have remained a powerful kingdom rather than the core of an empire. Bismarck did not create all the forces that made unity possible, but he recognized their timing, shaped their direction, and joined them to the authority of the Prussian crown. Few statesmen have altered the political geography of Europe so completely within one lifetime. The tragedy, if one uses that word carefully, is that he could not make his own restraint hereditary. After 1871, he knew Germany needed limits. It needed to avoid unnecessary wars, keep France isolated, prevent Russia from becoming an enemy, and reassure Britain where possible. Those judgments were not written deeply enough into the habits of the state. They remained too dependent on the man who had made them. When he left office, and then when he left life, Germany still possessed power. But power is not the same as judgment. At Friedrichsruh, after the ceremonies had ended and the visitors had gone away, the physical world remained less dramatic than the legend. Trees stood around the estate. Papers lay in order or disorder according to the habits of those who preserved them. The rooms that had once received princes, journalists, officers, and admirers became rooms of memory. Outside them, the empire continued to send trains through the country Bismarck had helped bind together, across provinces that had once belonged to separate political worlds. The old German Confederation was gone. The Federal Diet at Frankfurt was gone. The Prussian budget crisis, the Danish War, the field near Königgrätz, the edited words from Ems, the hole of mirrors at Versailles, the Kulturkampf debates, the insurance laws, the Congress of Berlin, and the quarrel with Wilhelm II had all passed into record. What remained was not a finished lesson, but a state carrying the marks of the man who had shaped it. Germany had been made, and making it had changed Europe. Bismarck's life had begun in the year of Vienna's settlement, when diplomats tried to restore balance after Napoleon. It ended in an empire that had disturbed that balance and then tried to preserve a new one. Between those 2 points lay the long 19th century story of monarchy adapting to nationalism, aristocracy using mass politics, war serving statecraft, and diplomacy trying to contain the consequences of its own success. He belonged to all of those movements, and none of them belonged to him entirely. In the end, the Iron Chancellor left behind something more complicated than iron. He left behind borders, offices, laws, alliances, memories, resentments, and habits of authority. He left behind a Germany powerful enough to command attention and uneasy enough to require care. He left behind admirers who made him into a founder, enemies who remembered the weight of his hand, and successors who inherited his creation without inheriting his caution in the same measure. Friedrichsruh settled back into the quieter life of an estate, though it could never again be only an estate. The house stood among its trees, holding papers, portraits, and the remains of a century's argument. Beyond it, railways crossed the German landscape. Church bells marked towns that had once belonged to different states. Factory whistles called workers into mornings of imperial industry, and government offices kept the records of sickness funds and military service. The empire moved on in ordinary sounds. There was no single moment when Bismarck's age ended. It thinned gradually through new ministers, new treaties, new ambitions, new voters, and new fears. His name stayed, carved into monuments and spoken in arguments, but the living hand was gone. The country he had made continued beneath a sky he no longer watched, carrying his design into years he would not govern. While the trees around Friedrichsruh held their shade over the old Chancellor's grave, and the long roads of Germany ran on into the coming century,